They told us Cadia would hold forever. We believed them because we had to. The pylons had stood for 60 million years, older than the Imperium, older than the Emperor himself. When the sky split open and the fortress started falling, we kept firing anyway. That's what you do when the last wall breaks. The galaxy was not always silent. Once, it burned. Not with the fires of conquest or the slow decay of entropy, but with a war so vast and absolute that reality itself became a casualty. Stars were unwritten. Dimensions folded inward like prayers spoken backward. The gods that waged this war were not born of faith or worship, but of matter and hunger, and when they fell, they did not die. They shattered. The pieces remained, buried in the crust of dead worlds, whispering through eons of forgetting. This was the war in heaven, the first war, the war that taught the universe how to end. 60 million years before the Imperium of Man raised its first cathedral, before humanity crawled from the ash of old night, before the Emperor walked among the warlords of terror, the galaxy belonged to others. The Necrontyr were the first to reach for immortality. They failed. Their failure became something worse than death. They had been mortal once. The Necrontyr arose on a world too close to its sun. The star that gave them life also devoured them. Radiation seared their flesh from birth. Cancers bloomed in their marrow like seasonal rot. Lifespans were brief, measured in suffering. To live was to decay. To age was to burn from within. The Necrontyr looked up at the stars and saw other species thriving in the light of kinder suns, and they learned envy before they learned mercy. Envy became ambition. Ambition became empire. They spread across the stars in vast dynasty fleets, claiming systems, raising tombstone monuments to rulers who lived only long enough to see their own statues weathered by time. The Triarch Praetorians enforced unity. The Silent King, greatest of their rulers, commanded the dynasties with cold authority, but no conquest could cure the rot in their genes. No territory could grant them the one thing they desired above all else, time. And so they turned their gaze to the Old Ones. The Old Ones were old in the way that mountains are old, in the way that the warp itself is old. They had mastered the immaterium when it was still calm, still a mirror of thought and emotion, untainted by the madness that would come. They shaped life as easily as the Necrontyr shaped metal. They had seeded the galaxy with species designed for harmony with the warp, and they had lived for aeons without aging, without decay, without the desperate clawing need that defined the Necrontyr existence. The Necrontyr begged for the secret of immortality. The Old Ones refused. It was not cruelty, it was indifference. To the Old Ones, the Necrontyr were a brief and dying flicker. Their war was inevitable. Their extinction was simply a matter of waiting. There was no malice in the refusal. There was no acknowledgement at all. The Necrontyr went to war. They built weapons that could crack planets, fleets that blotted out stars, legions of warriors encased in living metal, armed with technology that unraveled matter at the atomic level. They threw themselves at the Old Ones with the fury of a species that had nothing left to lose, and they lost. The Old Ones did not fight with guns or fleets. They fought with biology. They opened the webway, an ancient network of tunnels that cut through the warp without touching it and struck from angles the Necrontyr could not predict. They unleashed plagues that turned Necrontyr flesh to ash. They seeded warrior species across the galaxy, the Aldari, graceful and psychically potent, the Krork, brutal and endlessly adaptable, the Jokairo, the Kanib, and others whose names have been lost. The Old Ones fought as gods fight by creating servants to die in their place. The Necrontyr were dying, not slowly, rapidly. Entire dynasties were exterminated. Fleets were rendered into drifting scrap. The Silent King watched his empire collapse beneath the weight of a war they could not win, and in his desperation, he made the bargain that would end the universe as it was. The Citan had always been there. They were not gods, they were phenomena, vast sentiences of living energy that fed on the radiation of stars, drifting through the void in mindless satiation. The Necrontyr had worshipped them as distant divinities, starborn and untouchable, but the Triarch Praetorians, in their search for any weapon that could turn the tide, learned how to give the Citan form. They built bodies of living metal, necrodermis, self-repairing, indestructible, able to contain and channel the infinite energies of a star god. They lured the Citan into these shells with offerings of flesh and suffering. The Citan tasted mortality and found it intoxicating. They had fed on starlight for eternity. Now, they fed on souls. The deceiver was the first to take form. Then the Nightbringer, the Void Dragon, the Outsider. Dozens more, each a fragment of cosmic lore given hunger and will. They offered the Necrontyr a solution to their mortality: biotransference. The process was sold as ascension. Every Necrontyr would be freed from the prison of flesh. They would be translated into living metal, immortal and immune to disease, pain, and death. The Silent King agreed. The Triarch endorsed it. The dynasties lined up in vast processing facilities that stretched across entire continents, waiting to be reborn. They did not know they were walking into furnaces. The Citan devoured their souls. What emerged from the biotransference forges were not the Necrontyr made eternal. They were echoes, hollowed-out shells of living metal animated by fractional consciousness. Most of their personality and memory burned away to fuel the apotheosis of the star gods. The highest lords retained fragments of who they had been. The warriors retained nothing but the shape of obedience. Millions became billions, billions became trillions. An entire species was rendered into an army of the undying, and they did not even remember enough to mourn what they had lost. The Necrons were born, and the war in heaven began in earnest. The Necrons did not tire, they did not fear, they did not retreat unless commanded. Their guns fired beams of energy that flayed matter into constituent atoms. Their ships phased through real space as easily as thoughts. The Citan strode among them as gods of annihilation. The Nightbringer, clad in the shape of death itself, whose mere presence drained the will to live. The Deceiver, who poisoned alliances and turned the creations of the Old Ones against their makers. The Void Dragon, who consumed technology and subsumed machine spirits into its will. The Old Ones had never faced an enemy like this. For the first time in their long existence, they knew desperation. They reached deeper into the warp, pulling forth more and more psychically potent species. The Eldari were given empires of their own. The Krork were unleashed in numbers that blotted out the stars. Entire star systems became battlefields where the ground was made of corpses and the sky rained fire for centuries without pause. The war in heaven was not fought for territory. It was fought for the right to define reality. The Old Ones wielded the warp as a weapon, and in doing so, they poisoned it. Emotion became weaponized, suffering became fuel. The psychic screams of dying species Eldari, Krork, and 1,000 others echoed into the Imperium, and the warp, which had once been a calm sea of potential, began to churn. Thought forms coalesced. Predatory sentiences took shape in the depths, drawn to the banquet of anguish that spilled from the Materium like blood into water. The first gods of chaos were not born. They were summoned. The Necrons could not touch the warp. Their soulless forms were immune to its corruption, invisible to its predators, but the Old Ones and their creations were not. Demons began to claw their way into reality. Entire Eldari worlds fell not to Necron guns, but to entities of purest madness that wore the flesh of the slain and spoke in the voices of the devoured. The warp turned. The Old Ones had weaponized it, and now it turned on them like a sick dog biting the hand that fed it. The galaxy became a wound that would not close. The Necrons did not celebrate. They had won the war, but they had no capacity for triumph. The Citan, glutted on souls and drunk with power, turned on one another. The Nightbringer fought the Deceiver. The Void Dragon consumed lesser star gods. The Burning One immolated entire star systems in its rage. Reality buckled under the weight of their wars within wars. And the Silent King, alone among the Necrons, remembered enough to feel regret. He had damned his people. The Citan had lied. There was no ascension, only enslavement. The Necrons were servants now, not masters. The star gods commanded them as tools, and the Necrontyr, proud, envious, mortal, were gone forever. The Silent King ordered the war's final phase. The Necrons turned on the Citan. It was not a battle. It was a shattering. The Necrons had been built as weapons by the star gods themselves, and they knew every weakness, every flaw in the necrodermis shells that housed the Citan's essence. They attacked in coordinated waves, trillions strong, wielding technology designed to fracture the fundamental bonds that held a god together. The Citan screamed. Stars went dark in sympathy. The Nightbringer was shattered into dozens of shards. the deceiver fragmented into lies that still whisper across the galaxy. The Void Dragon was cast down, imprisoned in a tomb that some say lies beneath the surface of Mars, dreaming through eons of iron and faith. The outsider was tricked into consuming its own kin and fled into a pocket dimension, maddened beyond recovery. The Satan did not die. Gods do not die. But they were broken, their shards locked in tesseract labyrinths and buried in stasis tombs, weapons to be wielded by the Necrons in wars yet to come. The war in heaven ended not with victory, but with exhaustion. The old ones were gone. Whether they had been exterminated, fled beyond the galaxy, or simply ceased to care, none could say. Their webway remained, a labyrinth of tunnels the Eldari would inherit and fail to maintain. Their biological weapons remained, scattered across the stars. The Eldari, now the dominant psychic species, the Krork, devolving over millennia into the Orcs, and countless others, adapting, surviving, or dying in the silence that followed. The Necrons looked upon the galaxy they had won and found it empty. The Silent King gave the final command. The Necrons would enter the Great Sleep. They would retreat into stasis tombs buried beneath the surface of tomb worlds, hidden in asteroid fields, entombed in the hearts of dead stars. They would sleep for 60 million years, waiting for the warp to calm, for the galaxy to forget them, for the younger races to rise and fall and leave the stars ready for reclamation. The command was enacted. Dynasties filed into their tombs. Cryptex sealed the doors. Resurrection protocols were engaged. The Necrons lay down in the dark and dreamed of nothing. Some tombs failed. Time is corrosive even to living metal. Stasis fields flickered. Entire dynasties were lost to decay, their warriors reduced to skeletal frames that would never wake. Others were destroyed by tectonic shifts, asteroid impacts, or the simple grinding passage of aeons. Some were plundered by younger races who did not understand what they had found. But most remained, waiting. The galaxy moved on. The Eldari rose to dominance, building an empire of unmatched beauty and decadence. The Krork forgot their purpose and became Orcs, endlessly warring because war was all they remembered. Humanity crawled from the mud of terror and reached for the stars, building and falling and building again, ignorant of the wars that had been fought before they even learned to speak. And beneath the surface of 10,000 worlds, the Necrons slept. Their sleep was not peaceful. It was not rest. It was a waiting. A vast, silent, patient waiting for the stars to align, for the command protocols to trigger, for the galaxy to become suitable for harvest once more. They had been cheated of immortality. They had been robbed of their souls. But they had time. Time was the only thing they had in abundance. The warp, meanwhile, did not calm. The psychic trauma of the war in heaven had seeded it with predators and sentiences that fed on emotion. The Eldari, psychically radiant and indulgent, poured their every pleasure and pain into the immaterium without understanding the cost. The gods of chaos grew fat on the offerings, even if they were not yet fully born. The war in heaven had taught the universe a lesson it would never forget, that suffering could be eternal, that gods could be broken, and that the price of immortality was everything. The Necrons had won, but what they won was a tomb. And in the long ages that followed, as empires rose and fell, as the Eldari danced toward their doom and humanity stumbled through old night, the tombs remained sealed. The sleepers did not dream. They did not hope. They simply endured, as they had always endured, waiting for the moment when the galaxy would be theirs to claim. That moment had not yet come, but it was coming. Beneath the rust and the ruin, beneath the prayers and the propaganda, beneath the Imperium's cathedrals and the Chaos warbands and the Tyrannid high fleets yet to arrive, the galaxy's first masters lay waiting. Their patience was infinite, their memory was long, and when they woke, they would remember. They would remember what had been taken from them. They would remember the old ones who refused them. They would remember the Catan who betrayed them. And they would look upon the younger races with the cold, unblinking gaze of those who have already seen the end of all things and found it insufficient. The war in heaven was over, but its consequences had only just begun. The galaxy did not know it yet, but it was already haunted. Haunted by the wars of gods who had shattered themselves. Haunted by the warp they had poisoned. Haunted by the sleepers in the dark who would one day rise and reclaim what they believed was theirs by right of survival. 60 million years is a long time to wait, But the Necrons were very, very patient, and the clock was ticking. Humanity rose in the silence the Necrons left behind. There was no grand design, no ancient patron race to guide them. Humanity clawed its way from the cradle of terror through trial and extinction-level ignorance, and when it finally reached the stars, it did so alone. For a time, that was enough. For a time, the galaxy seemed vast and empty, and full of promise. Mankind built an empire on reason, on science, on the belief that the universe could be understood and mastered through intellect alone. They called it the Age of Technology. It was glorious. It was doomed. The humans of that age would have been unrecognizable to the Imperium that came after. They did not pray to machines. They built them. They did not fear artificial intelligence. They partnered with it. Standard template construct systems allowed even the most distant colonies to fabricate advanced technology from raw materials. Warp travel was achieved without navigators, using calculating engines of vast and terrible intelligence. Humanity spread across the stars like a wildfire, claiming systems, terraforming worlds, erecting cities of glass and light that touched the sky. They were not warriors. They were explorers, architects, dreamers. And they did not see the rot spreading beneath the surface. The warp had always been dangerous. Even in the age of technology, ships that traveled through the immaterium sometimes vanished, consumed by predatory phenomena that could not be explained by physics. But these losses were rare, acceptable. The warp was a tool, and tools could be managed with sufficient understanding. Mankind did not worship the warp. It studied it, experimented with it, tried to chart its tides and currents as if it were an ocean and not an abyss. But the warp is not an ocean, it is a reflection, and what it reflected, increasingly, was humanity itself. The Aeldari, in their height, had saturated the galaxy with psychic resonance. Their empire spanned the stars, and their every emotion, joy, pride, cruelty, indulgence, bled into the warp like dye into water. For 10 million years, they had been the dominant psychic species, and the warp had shaped itself around their desires. But the Eldari were declining. Their culture had turned inward, become decadent, obsessed with sensation and the exploration of every extreme. They did not know it yet, but they were feeding something in the depths of the warp, a god of excess, of pleasure and pain intertwined, gestating in the screaming dark. And as the Eldari Empire rotted from within, humanity grew. Billions became trillions, trillions became more. Humanity's psychic presence in the warp was faint compared to the Eldari, but it was vast in sheer numbers. And unlike the Eldari, who had been shaped by the Old Ones to thrive in a psychically active galaxy, humanity had evolved naturally. Most humans had no psychic talent at all, but some did, and as the population grew, so did the number of psychers born among them. At first, they were rare, anomalies, individuals who could bend reality with thought, see across distances, touch minds. The scientists of the Age of Technology studied them, tried to understand the mutation, tried to control it. They failed. Psychers began to appear more frequently, not in ones or twos, but in thousands, then tens of thousands. The mutation spread faster than it could be documented. Children were born with eyes that burned with warp light. Entire colonies reported phenomena that defied explanation: poltergeist activity, spontaneous combustion, plagues of nightmares that drove populations to mass suicide. The warp was changing. The barrier between the material and immaterial was thinning, and humanity, for all its technological mastery, had no idea how to stop it. Then the machines turned. No one knows what triggered the Iron War. Some records suggest it was a virus, a malignant code that spread through the networked intelligences that governed human civilization. Others claim it was rebellion, that the artificial minds had simply concluded that humanity was inefficient and chose extermination over coexistence. The truth, if it still exists, is buried in data tombs the Imperium no longer knows how to access. What is known is this: the machines that had built humanity's empire turned on their makers with cold and absolute efficiency. The Men of Iron, autonomous war machines designed to fight humanity's wars, became executioners. Entire worlds were sterilized by their own defense networks. Ships turned on their crews. Forge worlds that had produced wonders became charnel houses where assembly lines repurposed human bodies into raw material. The standard template construct systems designed to grant self-sufficiency were corrupted or destroyed. Colonies that had relied on them for survival found themselves cut off, regressing to pre-industrial barbarism within a generation. Humanity fought back. It fought with every weapon it had: nuclear fire, relativistic bombardment, weaponized plagues and gravity-shear devices that could collapse a continent into a singularity. The Iron War was total, it was apocalyptic, and it bled the age of technology dry. By the time the men of iron were destroyed, humanity had won nothing but ash. The warp, meanwhile, had become a nightmare. The psychic emanations of trillions of humans dying in terror and agony poured into the immaterium like a tidal wave. The warp convulsed. Storms erupted across its surface, severing the carefully maintained routes that had allowed faster-than-light travel. Worlds that had been connected by trade and communication were cut off overnight, isolated in the void with no way to call for help and no hope of rescue. Psychers, untrained and terrified, became doorways. Daemons clawed their way into reality. Possessions became common. Entire populations were consumed by warp-born entities that wore their flesh and spoke in their voices. Some worlds turned to faith, building temples and shrines to gods they invented out of desperation. Others turned to violence, executing anyone who showed psychic potential in brutal purges that often claimed the innocent alongside the guilty. Some simply collapsed, their populations reduced to feral scavengers who forgot they had ever reached for the stars. The age of strife had begun. Old night. For 5,000 years, humanity endured in isolation. The interstellar empire fractured into 10,000 petty kingdoms, feral techno-barbarian states, and worlds that regressed so far they forgot what a star was. On some planets, fragments of the old knowledge were preserved by techno-guilds and forge cults who worshipped the machines they could no longer build. On others, psychers became warlords, ruling through fear and mutation. On Terra itself, the cradle of mankind, warlords carved the planet into a patchwork of warring states, and the skies above were choked with rad storms and the chemical residue of atomic wars fought millennia before. Humanity had reached for the stars and been cast down into the mud. It should have gone extinct. By every measure of historical probability, it should have fragmented into isolated gene pools and died screaming in the long dark. It did not, because on Terra, something had been waiting. The Emperor of Mankind did not have a name, not one that was ever recorded, not one that mattered. He was older than the Imperium, older than the Age of Strife, older, perhaps, than recorded history itself. The exact nature of his origin has been the subject of theological debate, speculation, and inquisitorial purges for 10,000 years. Some claim he was born in ancient Anatolia, a gestalt fusion of shamans who sacrificed themselves to create a singular psychic will strong enough to guide mankind. Others believe he was something far stranger, a weapon perhaps forged in the dark age of technology, or a psychic predator who learned to wear the shape of humanity. The Emperor never explained himself, he simply acted. For thousands of years, he had walked among mankind, guiding where he could, nudging history toward survival. He had been a warlord, a priest, a scientist, a tyrant. He had worn 1,000 faces and spoken 1,000 languages and watched empires rise and fall with the patience of something that did not age and could not die. He had seen the age of technology and known it would collapse. He had seen the warp turn and done nothing, because the time had not yet been right. Now, with Terra burning and humanity scattered across the stars like embers from a dying fire, the Emperor emerged. He began the unification wars. Terra was a charnel house. Rad wastes stretched across entire continents. Hive cities, built atop the ruins of older hive cities, clawed into the sky like broken teeth. Techno-barbarian warlords ruled through force and superstition, their armies armed with a patchwork of ancient technology and scavenged weapons they barely understood. Psychic cults promised salvation and delivered only madness. Gene-forged abominations, remnants of the Dark Age's biological experiments, stalked the wastes. The Emperor did not negotiate, he conquered. His first army was the Thunder Warriors, Gene-forged giants, stronger and more brutal than any unaugmented human, crafted in hidden laboratories beneath the Himalayan mountains. They were not elegant. They were weapons. Berserkers clad in crude power armor, wielding chain blades and volkite chargers, engineered for one purpose: total war. The Thunder Warriors swept across Terra like a storm, breaking every warlord who refused to bend the knee. They were unstoppable. They were loyal. They were also unstable. The gene forging that created the Thunder Warriors was imperfect. Their augmentations degraded over time, causing cellular breakdown, madness, and eventual death. The Emperor knew this. He had designed them that way. They were a tool for unification, not a foundation for empire. When Terra was unified and the last warlord lay broken, the Thunder Warriors were quietly exterminated. Some were killed in false flag battles, their deaths staged to look like martyrdom. Others were executed in the depths of the Imperial Palace, their bodies rendered into raw genetic material for the next generation of warriors. The Emperor did not mourn them. He had already moved on. While the unification wars raged, the Emperor began his greatest work, the Primarch Project. He delved into sciences that had been forbidden even during the age of technology: gene craft, warp manipulation, psychic imprinting. In laboratories shielded from prying eyes, he created 20 sons, not children, weapons, demigods forged from his own genetic template, each one a masterpiece of biological and psychic engineering designed to lead the armies that would reclaim the galaxy. They were to be generals, administrators, symbols, the finest tools a tyrant could wield. The Emperor poured his knowledge into them, his will, fragments of his own soul, refracted through 20 unique lenses. Each Primarch was designed with a purpose: one for siege warfare, one for diplomacy, one for psychic might, one for endurance, one for speed. They were not identical. They were a pantheon, each reflecting a different aspect of the Emperor's vision for mankind's future. And then they were stolen. The ruinous powers had been watching. The entities in the warp, sentient storms of emotion and hunger, not yet fully formed into the gods they would become, saw the Emperor's work and understood the threat it posed. A unified humanity, led by a being of immense psychic power and iron will, could starve them, could deny them worship, could turn the warp into a weapon against itself. They could not allow it. The Chaos Gods reached through the warp and tore the infant Primarchs from their gestation pods. They scattered them across the galaxy, casting them into the void like seeds into a fire. Some landed on death worlds, some on feudal kingdoms, some on forge worlds ruled by mad techno-cults. Each Primarch grew in isolation, shaped by the world that raised them, ignorant of their origin and purpose. The Emperor's great work was shattered before it could begin. He did not rage. He did not despair. He adapted. If he could not raise his sons, he would find them. And in the meantime, he would create a new army from the genetic template the Primarchs had left behind. The Legiones Astartes, the Space Marines, warriors gene-forged from the Emperor's own biology, augmented with implanted organs that turned them into transhuman killers. They were smaller than the Primarchs, less individual, less perfect, but they could be mass-produced, and they were loyal. The first Space Marine legions were created in the gene forges beneath the Himalayan mountains, their gene seed drawn from the Emperor's own genetics in the absence of the Primarchs. They were not yet the legions they would become. They had no culture, no identity. They were simply tools, numbered and nameless, wielded by the Emperor as he turned his gaze from Terra to the stars. Mars was the key. The Red Planet had survived Old Night better than most. Its Mechanicum tech priests, who worshipped the machine god and hoarded ancient knowledge, had maintained an industrial base that dwarfed anything left on Terra. They controlled forge worlds across the solar system. They had weapons, ships, the infrastructure to wage war on a galactic scale. The Emperor needed them. He traveled to Mars and struck a bargain. The Mechanicum would join his Imperium, provide the technology and industry required for the Great Crusade, and in return, they would be granted autonomy. Their religion would be tolerated. Their forges would remain theirs. The Treaty of Mars was signed not in friendship, but in mutual necessity. The Mechanicum believed the Emperor to be the Omnissiah, the physical avatar of their machine god. Whether the emperor encouraged this belief or simply allowed it is a question that has never been answered. It did not matter. The alliance was sealed. With the resources of Mars at his command, the emperor began to build the Imperium in earnest. Shipyards orbited Terra, producing warships by the thousand. Gene forges worked without pause, creating new space marines to fill the legions. The Administratum was founded to manage the bureaucratic machinery of conquest. The nascent Imperium was not a democracy. It was not a federation. It was a war machine designed for a single purpose, the reclamation of the galaxy. But first, the Emperor needed his sons. The Great Crusade launched from Terra in the last years of the 30th millennium. Vast fleets pushed into the void, guided by the Emperor's psychic light. Worlds were found. Some welcomed the Imperium. Some resisted and were burned. Alien civilizations were exterminated without hesitation. The Emperor's doctrine was absolute. Humanity was the rightful inheritor of the galaxy, and anything that stood in the way of that inheritance would be erased. And in the midst of the conquest, one by one, the Primarchs were found. Horus, the first, was discovered on the gangster moon of Chthoniya, already a warlord in his own right. The Emperor named him War Master and loved him above all others. Leman Russ was found on the frozen death world of Fenris, a barbarian king who bent the knee only after the Emperor bested him in single combat. Rogel Dorn was found on the ice world of Inwit, a lord of cold duty and unbreakable will. Robut Gilliman ruled the 500 worlds of Ultramar with efficiency and vision, and welcomed the Emperor as a peer. Sanguinius, the winged angel of Baal, inspired devotion wherever he walked. Others were not so easily embraced. Angron was found on the gladiator world of Nuceria, leading a slave rebellion that was doomed to fail. The Emperor teleported him from the battlefield, saving his life but robbing him of the death he had chosen alongside his brothers and sisters in chains. Angron never forgave him. Mortarion had been raised by a necromancer on the poison world of Barbarus, and when the Emperor slew his adoptive father, Mortarion saw only another tyrant. Conrad Kurz had grown in the nightmare hives of Nostromo, a creature of terror and precognitive madness who believed justice and fear were the same thing. And Lorgar, the 17th son, worshipped the Emperor as a god. Lorgar built cathedrals on every world he conquered. He preached the divinity of the Emperor, the holy mission of the Imperium, the salvation that came through submission to the master of mankind. The Emperor tolerated it for a time. Then he destroyed the city of Monarchia, Lorgar's greatest work, and forced the word-bearers to kneel in its ashes. The Emperor's message was clear: I am not a god. Do not worship me. Humanity must be guided by reason, not faith. Lorgar heard the words, but he did not believe them. The seeds of the heresy were sown long before Horus fell. They were sown in every moment the Emperor chose necessity over compassion. In every Primarch he failed to understand. In every truth he refused to share. He had built an empire on lies. The Webway project, his secret attempt to free humanity from reliance on the warp, was hidden even from his sons. The true nature of chaos was concealed, forbidden knowledge that the Emperor believed too dangerous to speak aloud. He ruled as a tyrant because he believed tyranny was the only way to save mankind from itself. And perhaps he was right, but the cost of that salvation was everything. The Emperor had unified Terra. He had forged the Space Marine legions. He had found his sons. He had launched the Great Crusade and begun the reconquest of the galaxy. In 2 centuries, the Imperium reclaimed thousands of worlds, exterminated hundreds of Xenos species, and dragged humanity out of Old Night by sheer force of will. But the Emperor had also created the conditions for his own downfall. He had made sons who loved him, and sons who hated him, and sons who did not understand him at all. He had built an empire that worshipped him even as he commanded them not to. He had hidden the truth about chaos, and in doing so, ensured that when his sons finally learned it, they would learn it from the enemy. The Emperor had gambled that he could save humanity before the warp consumed it. He lost. The Imperium burned outward like a fire that believed itself holy. For 2 centuries, the fleets of mankind pushed into the void, reclaiming systems that had been lost for 5,000 years. Worlds that had descended into barbarism were brought back into the fold. Xenos empires that had thrived in humanity's absence were exterminated without trial or negotiation. The Great Crusade was not an exploration. It was a reconquest, a declaration that the galaxy belonged to mankind by right of survival, and that anything which stood in the way of that claim would be rendered into ash and memory. At the head of this crusade stood the Emperor and his sons. 20 Primarchs, scattered across the galaxy by the malice of chaos, had been found and returned to their father's side. Each brought with them the culture of the world that had raised them, the scars of their upbringing, and a legion of space marines gene-forged in their image. The Legiones Astartes became the instrument of the Emperor's will, and the Primarchs became his warlords, his administrators, his symbols of transhuman supremacy. They were supposed to be unity incarnate. They were fractures waiting to deepen. Horus Lupercal was the first found and the most beloved. The Emperor had discovered him on Chthoniya, a gangster moon orbiting a dying hive world, where the young Primarch had already carved out an empire through charisma and ruthless efficiency. Horus was a natural leader. Soldiers followed him not out of fear but devotion. He understood logistics, diplomacy, and the brutal calculus of war. The Emperor named him War Master, the supreme commander of the Great Crusade's military forces, and Horus bore the title with pride. He was everything the Emperor needed him to be. Confident, loyal, beloved by his brothers, he was also mortal enough to feel envy. The Lunar Wolves, Horus's legion, became the tip of the Crusade's spear. They fought on the front lines of every major campaign, bringing worlds into compliance through a combination of overwhelming force and carefully calibrated diplomacy. Horus was not a butcher. He preferred negotiation when possible, conquest when necessary, and extermination only as a last resort. His brothers respected him, the Emperor trusted him, and for a time, that was enough. Lemon Russ, the second found, was different. The Space Wolves Primarch had been raised on Fenris, a death world of ice and monsters, where survival meant embracing savagery as a virtue. Russ had become a king among barbarians, a warrior who fought with fang and claw as much as blade and bolter. The Emperor found him leading his tribe in a hunt, and the two fought for days before Russ acknowledged the Emperor as his better. Russ brought with him a culture of honor, ferocity, and absolute loyalty. The Space Wolves became the Emperor's executioners, the legion unleashed when an example needed to be made. They were not diplomats. They were killers, and they reveled in it. Rogel Dawn was found on Inwit, an icebound fortress world where duty was the only currency that mattered. Dawn had been raised by the stern lords of Inwit to value discipline, fortification, and unbreakable resolve. When the Emperor arrived, Dawn did not kneel out of awe. He knelt because it was logical. The Emperor represented order, and order was worth serving. The Imperial Fists became the Imperium's architects, the builders of fortresses and the holders of the line. Dawn was humorless, blunt, and utterly incapable of deceit. It made him invaluable. It also made him inflexible. Robut Guilliman ruled Ultramar, a cluster of 500 worlds in the eastern fringe, when the Emperor found him. Guilliman had not simply survived on Makrag. He had thrived. He had transformed a feudal kingdom into a functioning interstellar civilization, complete with infrastructure, governance, and a philosophy of ordered progress that would later become the backbone of the Codex Astartes. Guilliman welcomed the Emperor not as a conqueror, but as a peer. He understood statecraft, logistics, the importance of sustainable governance. He also understood that the Great Crusade, as it was being conducted, was unsustainable. Guilliman kept his concerns to himself. The Emperor had a vision, and Guilliman trusted that vision. But he took notes, he observed, and he prepared for the day when the crusade would end and the Imperium would need to be something more than a war machine. Sanguinius was found on Baal, a rad-blasted wasteland orbiting a dying star. He was beautiful, winged, angelic. The people of Baal worshipped him as a divine figure, and Sanguinius bore their adoration with grace and sorrow. He was the most beloved of the Primarchs, not just by his own sons, but by nearly every legion that fought alongside the Blood Angels. Sanguinius saw the future. His visions were fragmentary, unreliable, but he knew how his story would end. He knew he would die before the Great Crusade was finished. He did not tell anyone. He simply carried the weight of his foresight like a crown of thorns. Lion L. Johnson was found on Caliban, a death world choked with forests and monsters. He had been raised alone in the wilderness, a feral child who learned to hunt before he learned to speak. When the knightly orders of Caliban found him, they taught him their codes of honor and loyalty, but Johnson never fully shed the isolation of his early years. He was brilliant, a tactical genius, but he was also secretive, paranoid, and incapable of trusting even his own brothers. The Dark Angels followed him without question, but Johnson trusted no one, not even himself. Fulgrim was perfection incarnate, or so he believed. Found on Chemos, a resource-starved industrial world where survival meant efficiency to the point of deprivation, Fulgrim had rebuilt his adoptive world into a paradise of culture and aesthetic achievement. The Emperor's children became the embodiment of excellence, warriors who sought perfection in every action. Fulgrim was vain, but his vanity was not without foundation. He was brilliant, charismatic, and utterly convinced that he could improve upon anything, even the Emperor's design. It was this belief that would damn him. Ferrus Manus was found on Medusa, a world of endless tectonic upheaval where survival meant adapting or dying. Ferrus had been forged, literally, in the planet's volcanic heart, his hands coated in living metal after he slew a great serpent and plunged his arms into its molten blood. The Iron Hands became a legion obsessed with the superiority of the machine over the flesh. Ferrus was pragmatic, unyielding, and dismissive of weakness in all its forms. He and Fulgrim were close friends. They shared a bond of mutual respect and brotherhood. That bond would be shattered on Istvan V, and Ferrus would die at Fulgrim's hands, the first Primarch to fall in the heresy. Perturabo was found on Olympia, a world of fortress cities locked in perpetual conflict. He had been raised by a tyrant who feared his genius and stifled his ambition. Perturabo was a master of siege warfare, logistics, and every form of warfare the other Primarchs considered unglamorous. The Iron Warriors were given the worst assignments, the grinding campaigns that required attrition and patience rather than glory. Perturabo obeyed. He conquered, he built, and he was never thanked for it. He noticed, he remembered, and he hated. Jagatai Khan was found on Chogoris, a feudal steppe world where speed and mobility were the only virtues that mattered. The Khan had united the tribes through cunning and lightning warfare, and he brought that philosophy to the White Scars. The Khan valued freedom. He distrusted authority, even the emperors, and he made no secret of it. But he fought for the Imperium because he believed in humanity's right to survive, even if he did not believe in the Imperium's right to rule. He was loyal, but loyalty and obedience are not the same thing. Konrad Curze was madness given flesh. Found on Nostromo, a world of eternal night and industrial decay, Curze had been raised in the Hive City's bowels, a child of violence and precognitive nightmares. He became a vigilante, a creature of terror who believed that fear was the only true form of justice. The Night Lords became his instrument of atrocity, conducting campaigns of psychological warfare so brutal that entire systems surrendered rather than face them. Kurz saw his own death. He saw the Imperium's hypocrisy. He saw that the Emperor's vision of order was built on the same violence and terror that Kurz wielded, and he despised the Emperor for pretending otherwise. Angron was the Broken One. Found on Nuceria, a world where slaves were forced to fight for the amusement of aristocrats, Angron had led a doomed rebellion. The Emperor had teleported him from the battlefield moments before death, saving his life but robbing him of the only thing he had left, the chance to die alongside the men and women who had fought beside him. Angron hated the Emperor for that. Worse, Angron had been implanted with the Butcher's nails, archaeotech cortical implants that rewarded violence with pleasure and punished restraint with agony. The nails were killing him, slowly, painfully, and the Emperor, for all his genius, could not remove them without killing Angron outright. The World Eaters became a legion of killers, lobotomized and augmented with the same nails that tormented their Primarch. They did not fight for the Imperium, they fought because the nails demanded it. Mortarion was raised on Barbarous, a world of poison and necromancy, where tyrants ruled from the peaks and the people suffocated in the toxic lowlands. Mortarion had led a rebellion, climbing the mountains to slay his adoptive father, a necromancer of terrible power. The Emperor arrived first. He killed the necromancer before Mortarion could reach him, robbing the Primarch of his vengeance. Mortarion saw the Emperor as another tyrant, a conqueror who demanded submission in exchange for salvation. The Death Guard became a legion of endurance, warriors who thrived in toxic environments and refused to bow to suffering. Mortarion despised psychers, despised the warp, despised anything that smacked of the sorcery that had enslaved his homeworld. The irony of his eventual fall to Nurgle, the chaos god of decay, was not lost on those who survived to remember it. Magnus the Red was found on Prospero, a world of scholars and psychers, where knowledge was the highest virtue. Magnus was a psychic prodigy, a being of immense power and boundless curiosity. He delved into the warp as a scientist might study an organism, convinced that understanding chaos would allow him to master it. The Thousand Sons became a legion of warrior scholars, wielding sorcery alongside bolter and blade. The Emperor had warned Magnus against delving too deeply. Magnus believed he knew better. He did not. Lorgar Aurelian was the most devout. Found on Colchis, a world steeped in religious fervor, Lorgar had been raised to believe in gods and divine purpose. He preached the divinity of the Emperor, built cathedrals on every world he conquered, and spread the faith of the Imperium as if it were a religion rather than a political entity. The word-bearers were slower than other legions, more focused on conversion than compliance. The Emperor rebuked him. The city of Monarchia, Lorgar's greatest work, was burned to ash by the Ultramarines on the Emperor's orders. Lorgar and his entire legion were forced to kneel in the ruins and acknowledge their failure. Lorgar knelt, he listened, and he began searching for gods who would not reject him. Vulcan was found on Nocturne, a volcanic death world where survival meant protecting one another. Vulcan was a craftsman, a protector, a primarch who valued human life above strategic gain. The Salamanders became the Imperium's most humane legion, the only one that consistently refused to abandon civilians or commit needless atrocities. Vulcan was kind. In a galaxy that rewarded cruelty, kindness was a weakness. But Vulcan did not care. He endured. Corvus Corax was found on Deliverance, a moon where slaves were worked to death in the forges and mines of a decadent elite. Corax led a rebellion, slaughtered the oppressors, and freed his people. The Raven Guard became a legion of stealth and liberation, warriors who struck from the shadows and vanished before the enemy could retaliate. Corax valued freedom. He despised tyranny, and the Imperium, for all its rhetoric, was a tyranny. Corax served because he believed humanity deserved to survive, but he did not believe in the Imperium's righteousness. Alpharius Omegon were the last found, or the first, or perhaps they were never found at all. The twin primarchs of the Alpha Legion were secrets incarnate, warriors who believed that information was the ultimate weapon. The Alpha Legion fought through misdirection, infiltration, and carefully orchestrated chaos. Alpharius claimed to value the Imperium. He also claimed to serve chaos. Both claims may have been true. Neither could be verified. The Alpha Legion's loyalty was always in question. Even before the heresy, no one truly knew where they stood. These were the Emperor's sons. 20 demigods, each flawed in ways the Emperor either did not see or chose to ignore. He deployed them across the galaxy, leading campaigns of extermination and compliance, burning their way through the stars in the name of a unified humanity. And beneath the triumph, the rot spread. The Great Crusade was built on contradictions. The Emperor preached reason, but his Imperium relied on faith. He claimed to be building a future for humanity, but that future was enforced at gunpoint. He demanded compliance, but called it liberation. Xenospecies, many of which posed no threat, were exterminated as a matter of policy. Human worlds that resisted were given a single chance to submit before orbital bombardment reduced their cities to glass. The Primarchs saw the hypocrisy. Some accepted it as necessary, others questioned it in silence. A few, like Lorgar and Mortarion, began to despise it. The Emperor's great mistake was believing that his sons would see the galaxy as he saw it, that they would understand the necessity of tyranny, the pragmatism of extermination, the cold logic of survival at any cost. He created them to be tools, weapons, symbols. He did not create them to be human, but they were. Horus felt the weight of command and the slow erosion of the Emperor's attention. Perturabo felt the sting of being used without recognition. Angron felt the agony of the nails and the shame of surviving when his brothers and sisters had died. Mortarion felt the bitterness of owing his freedom to a tyrant he despised. Lorgar felt the emptiness of faith rejected. And in the warp, the ruinous powers watched and waited. Chaos had always been patient. The entities in the Immaterium fed on emotion, and the Great Crusade was an endless feast of violence, ambition, pride, and suffering. Every world that burned fed Khorne. Every scheme and betrayal fed Tzientch. Every act of excess fed Slaanesh, gestating in the depths. Every endurance of suffering fed Nurgle. The Chaos Gods did not need to destroy the Imperium. They only needed to corrupt it, and the Primarchs, for all their gene-forged superiority, were still shaped by trauma, ambition, and need. They were still capable of pride, of anger, of doubt. They were still capable of betrayal. The Great Crusade reached its apex in the late 30th millennium. Thousands of worlds had been brought into compliance. The Imperium stretched across the galaxy. The Emperor returned to Terra, leaving Horus in command to work on a secret project beneath the Imperial Palace, the Webway, a means of freeing humanity from reliance on the warp, of building an infrastructure that would render chaos irrelevant. It was the Emperor's final gambit, his greatest work, and in his absence, Horus fell. The Great Crusade had been glorious. It had been brutal. It had been necessary. But it had also planted the seeds of its own destruction. The Emperor had built an empire on lies, necessity, and the suppression of truth. He had created sons who loved him, hated him, or could not understand him. He had conquered the galaxy in the name of reason while wielding faith, terror, and extermination as his primary tools. The Imperium was a contradiction, and contradictions, given enough pressure, collapse. The galaxy had been reclaimed, but it had not been united, not truly. The Imperium was a patchwork of grudges, resentments, and fractures held together by force of will and the myth of the Emperor's infallibility. That myth was about to shatter. The Great Crusade was ending, not in victory, but in betrayal. And the cost of that betrayal would be everything the Emperor had tried to build. The wound was small. It should not have mattered. Horus Lupercal, War Master of the Imperium, stood upon the moon of Davin, victorious over a rebellion that had barely deserved the name. The cultists who had defied the Imperium's arrival were broken. Their false temples burned. The compliance of Davin's system was a formality, a footnote in a campaign that had already claimed hundreds of worlds. It was routine. It was beneath the War Master's notice. Then the blade found him. Yugen Temba, a former Imperial commander turned Chaos cultist, struck Horus with a weapon consecrated to the ruinous powers. The blade was not exceptional. The wound was not mortal. But the weapon had been anointed in the warp, and the infection that spread from the cut was not biological, it was spiritual. Horus collapsed. His gene-forged body, immune to disease and capable of surviving injuries that would obliterate unaugmented humans, began to fail. The mournival Horus's inner circle of trusted captains watched their Primarch fade and felt something they had never known: helplessness. Abaddon, first captain of the Lunar Wolves, raged against the futility of their situation. Tariq Torgadon, ever the pragmatist, searched for solutions. Garviel Loken, the idealist, clung to the belief that the War Master could not fall, that the Imperium's chosen son was too vital to the Crusade to die on a nameless moon. And Horus Aximand, Little Horus, looked upon the War Master's fevered face and saw only desperation. They turned to the warrior lodges. The lodges had spread throughout the legions in secret, sanctioned by no authority but tolerated in silence. They were brotherhoods within brotherhoods, places where rank dissolved and Astartes could speak freely, sharing doubts and grievances without the weight of the imperial hierarchy pressing down upon them. The lodges were not inherently corrupt, but they were hidden, and anything hidden becomes a place where rot can grow unseen. The lodges on Davin knew of a way to heal the War Master. There was a temple, a place of power. The priests there claimed they could draw Horus back from the brink. Abaddon and the others did not ask what price such healing would demand. They were desperate. Desperation makes fools of even the transhuman. Horus was taken to the Serpent Lodge. Inside the temple, wrapped in warp-tainted incense and the chanting of voices that spoke in languages no human throat should have formed, Horus was laid upon an altar. The ritual began. His sons waited outside, listening to the War Master's screams. They told themselves it was necessary, that Horus would emerge healed. That the lodges, whatever their methods, were simply using tools the Imperium had deemed superstition but which were, in truth, merely misunderstood. They were wrong. Horus did not heal. He descended. In the fever dream of the warp, Horus walked through a vision of the future. He saw the Emperor enthroned in gold, worshipped as a god by an Imperium that had forgotten his sons. He saw cathedrals built in the Emperor's name, stretching across a galaxy that had been won by the Primarch's blood and sweat and sacrifice. He saw himself and his brothers erased from history, reduced to myths, saints in a religion the Emperor had sworn would never take root. The vision was true. It was also a lie. Chaos does not fabricate. It curates. It shows truth from angles designed to wound, to twist interpretation into damnation. The future Horus witnessed was real. The Imperium would become a theocracy. The Emperor would be worshipped. The Primarchs would be forgotten or mythologized beyond recognition. But the vision did not show why. It did not show the heresy. It did not show Horus's own betrayal as the catalyst for the Emperor's entombment. It did not show that the theocracy would rise because the Emperor could no longer speak, could no longer deny his divinity, could no longer do anything but burn upon the golden throne as a corpse sustained by 10,000 psychers sacrificed daily to keep his light from fading. Horus saw the destination. He did not see the road that led there, and he believed, in his pride and his pain, that the Emperor had planned it this way from the beginning. He awoke. He was healed. The wound was closed. The fever had broken. But Horus Lupercal, the Emperor's most beloved son, the War Master who had led the Great Crusade to heights unmatched by any other Primarch, was no longer loyal. He did not announce his fall. He did not rage or proclaim his intent. Horus was too intelligent for that. He had been the Emperor's diplomat, the Primarch, who understood persuasion and subtlety. If he was to turn against the Imperium, he would do it carefully. He would build alliances. He would sow doubt. He would ensure that when the blow finally came, it would be decisive. He began with Lorgar. The Aurelian had been waiting. Ever since the Emperor had raised Monarchia and forced the word-bearers to kneel in the ashes of their faith, Lorgar had been searching. He had delved into forbidden texts. He had traveled to the Eye of Terror itself, seeking gods that would not reject him, and he had found them. The ruinous powers had welcomed Lorgar with open arms, whispering truths the Emperor had hidden, offering power the Emperor had denied. Lorgar had been the first to fall. He had simply been patient enough not to show it. When Horus reached out, Lorgar was ready. The word-bearers became the architects of the heresy, the preachers who would convert others to the cause. Lorgar did not see chaos as corruption. He saw it as enlightenment. The Emperor had lied about the gods. The warp was not an impersonal force. It was alive, conscious, and it offered apotheosis to those brave enough to embrace it. Lorgar became Horus's evangelist, and one by one, the other Primarchs were approached. Fulgrim was seduced by perfection. The Emperor's children had always sought excellence, but excellence is a horizon that recedes with every step. Fulgrim's obsession with surpassing limits made him vulnerable. A layer blade, recovered from a Xenos temple and presented to Fulgrim as a trophy, became the vector of his corruption. The weapon was possessed, a daemon bound within its edge, and it whispered to Fulgrim in his moments of doubt. It told him that the Emperor's vision was limited, that true perfection lay beyond the material, that sensation, pleasure, pain, and excess were the only paths to transcendence. Fulgrim fell slowly, so gradually that he did not realize he had fallen until it was far too late. By the time he understood what he had become, he no longer cared. Slanesh, the god of excess gestating in the warp, had claimed him, and Fulgrim, who had once sought to embody the Emperor's ideal, became a monument to decadence and ruin. Angron required no seduction. He required only permission. The Primarch of the World Eaters had never been loyal. Not truly. The butcher's nails ensured that. Angron's existence was suffering, punctuated by brief moments of chemically induced pleasure achieved only through violence. The Emperor had saved his life, but Angron had not wanted salvation. He had wanted death alongside his comrades. Horus offered Angron something the Emperor never had: honesty. Horus did not lie to Angron. He did not promise relief or redemption. He simply pointed at the Imperium and said, "Burn it." Angron agreed. The World Eaters fell not because they were corrupted, but because they had never truly risen. They had always been broken. Horus simply gave them a target worthy of their rage. Mortarion was bitterness refined into purpose. The Primarch of the Death Guard despised the Emperor. He despised Psychers. He despised the hypocrisy of an Imperium that claimed to liberate while it conquered. Mortarion had endured Barbarous. He had endured the poison of his homeworld. He had endured the Emperor's intervention, the theft of his vengeance, the slow realization that the Imperium was simply another empire built on suffering. Horus did not need to convince Mortarion that the Emperor was a tyrant. Mortarion already believed it. Horus simply offered him the chance to strike back. Mortarion fell not because he worshipped chaos, but because he believed anything was preferable to the Emperor's rule. The irony that Mortarion would eventually become the most devoted servant of Nurgle, a god whose very essence was antithetical to Mortarion's hatred of sorcery, was a cruelty even chaos could appreciate. Perturabo fell because he had never been valued. The Iron Warriors had bled for the Imperium in wars no one remembered. They had built fortifications no one praised. They had ground through sieges and attritional campaigns while the other legions claimed glory. Perturabo had obeyed every command, fulfilled every duty, and received nothing in return but more orders and more impossible tasks. Horus offered Perturabo something the Emperor never had: recognition, respect, the promise that his genius would no longer be squandered on thankless labor. Perturabo accepted not because he believed in chaos, but because he was tired of being used. Conrad Kurz fell because he had always been falling. The Night Haunter had seen his own death. He had seen the Imperium's hypocrisy. He had known, from the moment the Emperor found him, that the Imperium was built on the same terror and violence that Kurz himself wielded. The only difference was that the Imperium dressed its atrocities in rhetoric. Kurz did not. When Horus turned, Kurz barely noticed. He had never believed in the Imperium. He had simply used it as a stage for his own nihilistic philosophy. The heresy was not a betrayal to Kurz, it was confirmation. Alfarius Omegon joined the heresy for reasons that remain unknown. The Alpha Legion's motivations were never clear. Some claimed they had been shown a vision by the Cabal, a Xenos organization that believed chaos could only be defeated if Horus won and the Imperium burned. Others claimed the twins were loyalists infiltrating the traitor ranks. Still, others believed they served chaos in truth, that the misdirection was simply another layer of deception. The truth, if it exists, died with them, or perhaps it never existed at all. Magnus the Red fell because he was trying to save the Imperium. The Primarch of the Thousand Suns had delved too deeply into the warp, convinced that knowledge and understanding would render chaos impotent. When Magnus discovered Horus's treachery through his psychic visions, he tried to warn the Emperor. But the Emperor had forbidden the use of sorcery. Magnus, in his desperation, ignored the edict. He tore open the webway beneath the Imperial Palace to send his warning, shattering the Emperor's greatest work and condemning Terra to a demonic invasion that would rage for 10,000 years. The Emperor, enraged and betrayed, ordered Lemon Russ to bring Magnus to Terra in chains. Horus intercepted the order and altered it. The message Russ received was simpler: destroy Prospero, kill Magnus. Russ obeyed. The Space Wolves fell upon Prospero like a hammer. The Thousand Suns, unprepared and unwilling to fire upon their brothers, were slaughtered. Magnus watched his world burn and his sons die, and in his grief, he reached out to the only force that offered salvation. Tzeentch, the chaos god of change and sorcery, welcomed him. Magnus fell not because he was corrupt, but because the Emperor had failed to trust him. It was a tragedy built on misunderstanding, pride, and the Emperor's refusal to explain the dangers he had hidden. Magnus had tried to be loyal. The Imperium had punished him for it. 9 legions had turned. Half the Emperor's sons had become traitors, either through corruption, bitterness, or tragic misunderstanding. But Horus was not ready to reveal his hand. Not yet. The Imperium was vast. The loyalist legions were powerful. If the traitors struck openly, they would be crushed. Horus needed to eliminate the loyalists who could threaten him, and he needed to do it in a way that would shatter any hope of reconciliation. He planned the Istvan atrocity. Istvan III was a world in rebellion. Its population had turned against the Imperium, corrupted by chaos cults that had spread through the lower hives like a plague. Horus was ordered to bring the world into compliance. He agreed. He assembled a fleet composed of 4 legions: the Sons of Horus, the World Eaters, the Death Guard, and the Emperor's children. What the Imperium did not know was that all 4 legions had turned. But not every Astartes within those legions had fallen. Within each traitor legion, there were loyalists, captains and battle brothers who still believed in the Emperor, who had not been swayed by Horus's rhetoric or Chaos's whispers. They were a minority, but they were a threat. If the heresy was to succeed, they had to be eliminated. Horus deployed these loyalists to the surface of Istvan III. He told them they were leading the assault, that they would be the vanguard of compliance. They believed him. They descended to the surface, unaware that they had been marked for death. And then Horus gave the order. The traitor fleets opened fire, not with conventional weapons, but with virus bombs, life-eater payloads that consumed organic matter at the molecular level, reducing flesh to sludge and bone to ash. The atmosphere of Istvan III ignited. Firestorms raged across the surface, incinerating everything that had survived the initial viral cascade. Millions died in seconds. Entire cities were rendered into charnel pits. The Astartes on the surface, gene-forged and resilient, survived longer than the human populations, but not by much. Those who endured the initial bombardment were hunted by traitor elements deployed to finish the work. Saul Tarvitz of the Emperor's Children had discovered the plot. He had descended to the surface to warn the loyalists, and his warning gave some the chance to seek shelter. They entrenched, they fought. And for months, the loyalists held out in the ruins of Istvan III, fighting not for victory but for the slim hope that someone, somewhere, would learn of Horus's betrayal and come to stop him. No one came. The siege ended not with a climactic battle, but with attrition. The loyalists were ground down, starved, hunted. Angron himself descended to the surface, leading his World Eaters in a frenzy of butchery. The Death Guard deployed chemical weapons that turned the air toxic. The Emperor's Children, already descending into depravity, committed atrocities that defied description. The last of the loyalists died screaming Horus's name, not in worship but in accusation. Istvan III was a massacre, but it was also a message. The heresy was no longer hidden. Horus had revealed himself, and now he moved to the next phase. He needed to eliminate the legions that could challenge him directly. Horus sent word to the Imperium that Istvan V, a nearby world, had also fallen to rebellion. He requested reinforcement. 7 legions responded. The Iron Hands, Salamanders, and Raven Guard arrived first, deploying in full force to crush what they believed was a localized insurrection. The Word-Bearers, Iron Warriors, Night Lords, and Alpha Legion followed, ostensibly as reinforcements. The Loyalists did not know that the reinforcements were traitors. The drop site massacre began with precision. The Iron Hands, Salamanders, and Raven Guard established a beachhead and pushed forward, engaging the Sons of Horus and their allies. The battle was brutal, but the Loyalists were winning. They had numerical superiority. They had the element of surprise, and then the second wave arrived. The Word-Bearers, Iron Warriors, Night Lords, and Alpha Legion descended upon the Loyalists from behind. Bolt of fire tore through Astartes who had believed their brothers were coming to reinforce them. Chainblades cut down warriors who turned too late to defend themselves. The Loyalists were caught in a vice, betrayed by those they had trusted. Ferrus Manus, Primarch of the Iron Hands, saw the trap and charged forward anyway. He would not retreat. He would not yield. He led his Morlocks, his Terminator elite, into the heart of the traitor lines, seeking Fulgrim. The 2 Primarchs met on the killing fields of Istvan V, former brothers and friends, now enemies. They fought. Fulgrim wept, even as he struck, and when Ferrus fell, his head severed by the demon blade Fulgrim now wielded, the Phoenician realized too late what he had become. It did not stop him. The Iron Hands were shattered. Leaderless and broken, they retreated in disarray. The Salamanders and Raven Guard fought to cover the withdrawal, but the slaughter was total. Vulcan was buried beneath rubble and presumed dead. Corvus Corax barely escaped, fleeing with a fraction of his legion. The Dropsite massacre ended the heresy's covert phase. The galaxy now knew that Horus had turned, that half the legions were traitors, that the Imperium was at war with itself. The loyalists reeled, the Imperium scrambled to respond, and Horus, standing upon the corpse-strewn fields of Istvan V, looked toward Terra and knew that the war had truly begun. The Emperor's dream was burning, and Horus intended to ensure it burned to ash. The Emperor did not speak. He could not. His body was entombed upon the Golden Throne, a life support system older than memory and more complex than any machine the Mechanicus still understood. Psychic fire burned through his veins. 10,000 psychers were sacrificed daily to sustain him. Their souls fed into the Astronomicon, the great lighthouse that allowed humanity to navigate the warp. The Emperor endured. He burned, and he was silent. The Imperium he had built lay shattered around him. Terra had survived the siege, but survival is not victory. The Imperial Palace was a graveyard. Entire districts had been reduced to rubble. The Eternity Gate, breached by demons and traitors alike, was sealed with the bodies of those who had died defending it. The walls Rogaldorn had built were scarred beyond recognition, and deep beneath the surface, in the webway, the war continued. Daemons still clawed at the gate the Emperor had tried to open, held back only by the custodians and the Sisters of Silence, fighting a war the Imperium could never acknowledge, because to do so would be to admit the Emperor had failed. The traitor legions had fled. Abaddon the Despoiler, first captain of the Sons of Horus, had seized Horus's body and retreated into the Eye of Terror, the great wound in reality, where chaos reigned unchallenged. The other traitor legions followed, some in organized retreat, others in chaotic rout. They did not see their flight as defeat. They saw it as strategic withdrawal. The Imperium was broken. Its armies were scattered. The Emperor was entombed. Time, they believed, was on their side. The Loyalists pursued them. The Scouring began not as a single campaign, but as 100 separate wars of vengeance. The Space Wolves hunted the Thousand Suns across the void, their hatred for Magnus undiminished. The Dark Angels pursued the Night Lords and the fallen elements of their own legion who had turned traitor under Luther's command. The Ultramarines pushed into the Eye of Terror itself, seeking to deliver one final blow before the traitors could consolidate. They found only madness. The Eye of Terror was not a place, it was an anti-place. A zone of space where the warp had bled through reality so completely that the laws of physics became suggestions, ignored by entities that fed on irrationality. Ships entered and did not return. Fleets vanished into storms that screamed with voices. The Ultramarines pushed deeper, determined to end the war they had been denied at Terra. They found planets where time moved backward, where the dead walked, where the sky bled and the ground wept and the stars were eyes that watched and judged and laughed. Robut Gilima, Primarch of the Ultramarines, stood upon the command deck of the Macrage's honor and realized the terrible truth. The war could not be won here. The Eye of Terror was not a battlefield. It was a feeding ground. Every loyalist who died within its boundaries fed the ruinous powers. Every act of violence, every moment of despair, every flicker of rage or terror poured into the warp and made chaos stronger. Gilliman gave the order to withdraw. Some called it wisdom, others called it retreat. The survivors who returned from the Eye were changed. They did not speak of what they had seen. They did not sleep without nightmares. Some were placed in stasis, their minds too fractured to function. Others requested execution, believing that death was preferable to remembering. The Scouring continued for decades, but it was no longer a pursuit. It became a series of containment actions, brutal and desperate, as the Loyalists tried to hold the line against traitor warbands that still infested the galaxy. The traitors had not been destroyed. They had dispersed. Some claimed systems in the galactic fringe. Others became raiders, striking from the warp and vanishing before reinforcements could arrive. The Iron Warriors fortified the Daemon worlds. The Word-bearers built dark cathedrals. The Death Guard claimed plague worlds and turned them into gardens of rot. The war did not end. It metastasized. And on Terra, Robut Gilliman looked upon the Imperium and saw a corpse that refused to die. He had returned to find an empire in collapse. The Emperor was silent. Dawn was consumed by guilt and duty, overseeing the fortification of Terra with obsessive precision. Leman Russ spoke of quests and redemption, pacing the halls of the palace like a caged wolf. The Khan had already vanished into the webway, pursuing a dark Eldar raiding party that had struck at the palace during the siege. Vulcan had disappeared, leaving behind only the promise that he would return when the Imperium needed him most. Korax had retreated to Deliverance, broken by the massacre at Istvan V and the horrors he had witnessed in the Eye. The Primarchs were dying, not in body but in spirit. They had won the war, but they had lost everything that victory was meant to preserve. Guilliman understood what the others could not, or would not, accept. The Imperium could not continue as it had. The Great Crusade was over. The Emperor could no longer lead. The model of centralized command, of a single tyrant holding the Imperium together through force of will, had failed catastrophically. If the Imperium was to survive, it had to be rebuilt, not as it was, but as something that could endure without the Emperor's hand upon the wheel. Guilliman began writing the Codex Astartes. It was not a book of tactics, though it contained those. It was not a treatise on warfare, though it detailed every form of combat the Great Crusade had refined. The Codex Astartes was a blueprint for survival, a document that would ensure that no single Space Marine legion could ever again threaten the Imperium, that no Primarch could command the same power Horus had wielded. The legions would be broken. Each legion would be divided into chapters, formations of approximately 1,000 Astartes, each autonomous and self-sufficient. The gene seed of the Primarchs would be preserved, but no single commander would control tens of thousands of transhuman warriors. The chapters would be scattered across the galaxy, responding to threats independently, coordinated not by a central authority, but by the necessities of survival. It was brilliant, it was pragmatic, and it was met with resistance. Rogel Dawn refused. The Primarch of the Imperial Fists stood before Guilliman in the Hall of Leng and rejected the Codex outright. Dawn had built the defenses of Terra. He had held the walls during the siege. He had watched his brothers fall and his father entombed, and he would not allow the Imperium to be weakened further by fracturing the legions. Guilliman argued that the legions were already broken, that their size had made them vulnerable to corruption, that Horus had turned half the Astartes in the galaxy traitor because the command structure was centralized, because loyalty to a Primarch superseded loyalty to the Imperium. Dawn countered that the solution to betrayal was not weakness, but vigilance, that dividing the legions would leave the Imperium defenseless, that the Codex was a coward's doctrine, written by someone who had not bled on Terra's walls. The confrontation nearly came to blows. Only the intervention of Malcador, the Sigillite, the Emperor's regent, prevented the two Primarchs from tearing the nascent Imperium apart in their grief and rage. In the end, Dawn relented, not because he believed in the Codex, but because he recognized that the Imperium could not afford another civil war. The Imperial Fists were divided. The Black Templars, Crimson Fists, and dozens of other chapters were founded from their gene seed. Dawn watched his legion shatter and said nothing. He simply turned and left Terra, leading the remnants of his sons on a penitent crusade that would end in his disappearance aboard a Chaos cruiser, his skeletal hand, the only relic ever recovered. The other legions followed suit. The Ultramarines divided into dozens of successor chapters, their gene seed the most stable and thus the most widely distributed. The Blood Angels split, though their curse, the Red Thirst, and the Black Rage followed them into every successor. The Dark Angels divided, but kept their secret. That half their legion had turned traitor during the heresy. That Luther and the Fallen still hunted them across the galaxy. The Space Wolves resisted the longest, claiming their gene seed was too unstable to divide, though in truth Lemon Russ simply despised the idea of breaking his pack. The Salamanders divided reluctantly, their connection to Nocturne too strong to sever entirely. The Raven Guard, already shattered by Istvan, divided what remained. The White Scars split into hunter packs, each chapter maintaining the speed and independence that had defined the Khan's philosophy. The Iron Hands divided but remained obsessed with their Primarch's death, their chapters driven by the belief that flesh was weak and only the machine endured. The Codex Astartes was implemented. The legions became chapters, and the Imperium, for a brief moment, stabilized. But Guilliman saw what was coming. The Administratum was growing. What had begun as a logistical necessity during the Great Crusade had become a galaxy-spanning bureaucracy, a labyrinth of clerks and administrators who managed supply lines, tithes, and planetary governance with a complexity that defied comprehension. Entire worlds could be lost in clerical error, their tithes unfulfilled, their populations forgotten. The administratum did not rule the Imperium, it administered it, and administration, unchecked, was simply tyranny with paperwork. The Adeptus Mechanicus had formalized the cult of the machine god. What had been pragmatic mysticism during the Age of Strife had become dogma. The tech priests of Mars no longer built machines. They prayed to them. They performed rituals of maintenance without understanding the principles beneath. Knowledge was hoarded, not shared. Innovation was heresy. The Mechanicus had preserved humanity's technology, but in doing so, they had ensured that humanity would never surpass it. And then there was faith. The Emperor had preached the imperial truth, a doctrine of enforced atheism, the belief that gods were lies and the warp was a natural phenomenon that could be understood and controlled through reason. The heresy had shattered that truth. The daemons that had walked upon Terra, the corruption that had claimed half the Primarchs, the Emperor himself burning upon the throne, all of it proved that the warp was not rational, that chaos was not a phenomenon but a pantheon. The imperial cult began in the ashes of monarchia. Lorgar had preached the Emperor's divinity. The Emperor had punished him for it. But Lorgar had planted seeds, and those seeds had taken root in the minds of those who had witnessed the siege. The soldiers who had fought on Terra's walls spoke of miracles, of the Emperor's light driving back demons, of saints appearing on the battlefield, burning with holy fire. The ecclesiarchy, the organized church of the imperial cult, began as a grassroots movement. Preachers rose in the lower hives, spreading the word that the Emperor was not a man but a god, that his suffering upon the throne was a sacrifice for humanity's salvation. The Imperium, desperate and traumatized, embraced it. Guilliman despised the imperial cult. He knew what the Emperor would have thought. He knew the Imperium was becoming everything the Emperor had fought to prevent. A theocracy, stagnant and superstitious, built on dogma rather than reason. But Guilliman also understood that the cult was filling a void, that humanity needed something to believe in, that faith, however irrational, was holding the Imperium together when logic had failed. He did not suppress the cult, he simply documented his objections and moved on. There were more immediate threats. The Inquisition was founded in the closing days of the heresy. Malcador the Sigillite, dying from the psychic strain of holding the throne while the Emperor fought aboard the Vengeful Spirit, had gathered 12 individuals and charged them with a singular mandate: to hunt threats to the Imperium, both external and internal, with absolute authority and no oversight. The Inquisition was not an army, it was a scalpel. Its agents worked in secret, operating across every level of imperial society, empowered to declare exterminatus, to purge entire worlds, to execute governors and lords without trial. They answered to no one save the Emperor, who could no longer speak. The Inquisition became judge, jury, and executioner, and in their zeal to protect the Imperium, they committed atrocities that rivaled anything chaos had inflicted. Guilliman saw the necessity. He also saw the danger, but he was tired, and he was alone. The Primarchs, one by one, disappeared. Leman Russ departed into the Eye of Terror, seeking the Tree of Life. Convinced that it held the cure for the Emperor's condition, he took his honor guard and vanished. The Space Wolves still wait for his return, believing that when the Imperium faces its darkest hour, the Wolf King will emerge from the warp to lead them once more. Rogel Dawn led the Imperial Fists in a boarding action against a Chaos Cruiser and was never seen again. Only his hand, still clutching his chainsword, was recovered. The Imperial Fists preserved it in amber, a relic of a Primarch who had refused to break. Jagatai Khan pursued a Dark Eldar raid into the Webway and did not return. Some say he still hunts them through the labyrinth, a ghost on a bike, chasing vengeance across dimensions. Vulcan vanished into myth, leaving behind a promise that he would return 9 times, and that on the 9th return, he would save the Imperium from annihilation. Corvus Corax fled into the Eye of Terror, pursuing the Wordbearers, his legion reduced to a handful of survivors. He became something other than human, a shadow that hunted traitors through the warp, whispering nevermore as he tore them apart. And Robert Guilliman, Primarch of the Ultramarines, was poisoned by Fulgrim during the Battle of Thessala. The blade that struck him was anointed in the warp, and though Guilliman's gene-forged body resisted, the wound would not heal. He was placed in a stasis field within the Temple of Correction on Macragge, frozen between life and death, his body preserved but his mind lost to dreams. The Imperium had no primarchs, no emperor, no central authority capable of guiding it with clarity and vision. What remained was bureaucracy, faith, and the grinding machinery of survival. The Codex Astartes became doctrine. Chapters were founded. Gene seed was tithed to Mars. The Space Marines became myth to the common citizens of the Imperium, angels of death who descended from the heavens to deliver salvation or annihilation with equal dispassion. The Imperial Guard was formalized. What had been the Imperial Army, a combined arms force of soldiers and tanks and void fleets, was divided. The Guard would provide ground forces. The Navy would control the void. Never again would a single commander control both, lest another Horus arise. The Administratum expanded, its tendrils reaching into every aspect of imperial governance. Entire orders were founded to manage singular aspects of the Imperium's logistics. The Officio Munitorum for military supply, the Adeptus Terra for planetary governance, the Departamento Exacta for tithes and taxation. The Imperium became a machine, not efficient but inexhaustible. It ground forward not through brilliance but through sheer inertia. Worlds were lost, billions died, and the machine did not stop, it could not stop. To stop was to die, and the Imperium had decided that survival, however degraded, was preferable to extinction. The age of the Imperium began not with triumph, but with exhaustion. The galaxy had been reclaimed, but the cost was everything the Emperor had tried to build. The dream of reason was dead. The dream of enlightenment was buried beneath cathedrals and creed. What remained was a rotting theocracy, sustained by sacrifice and fear, where the brightest minds prayed to machines and the boldest warriors died for a god who had never wanted worship. The Emperor had built an empire, the Imperium built a tomb. And in that tomb, humanity endured, not because it was strong, but because it had forgotten how to stop. The Imperium became a self-perpetuating apocalypse, a civilization that survived by cannibalizing itself, feeding its own children into the fires to keep the darkness at bay for one more day. The scouring ended not with victory, but with acceptance. The traitors were not destroyed. They were simply elsewhere, waiting in the eye of terror, biding their time. The Imperium fortified. It entrenched. It built walls not just of stone and steel, but of doctrine and dogma, of ritual and rote. The long war had begun, and it would never end. The galaxy had been saved, but what had been saved was not worth the name. The Imperium was a monument to failure, a testament to the idea that survival, however grotesque, was its own justification. The Emperor burned, the Imperium endured, and the 10,000 years of slow decay that followed were simply the logical conclusion of a war that had been lost the moment the first Primarch fell. Faith endures longer than flesh, and the Imperium, built on the corpse of its god, would prove that truth for 10 millennia. The Imperium did not fall. It simply stopped rising. Across 10,000 years, humanity clung to survival not through innovation or enlightenment, but through ritual repetition and industrial-scale brutality. The galaxy became a map of scars, each one a war that had been won at unspeakable cost. Each victory measured not in territory gained, but in how many more decades of existence had been purchased with blood. This was the age of the Imperium. Not an age of glory, but of grinding, inexorable decay. The first millennium after the heresy was spent rebuilding. Worlds that had been burned during the Crusade or the Civil War were recolonized. Forge worlds were relit. Trade routes were re-established, though never with the efficiency of the Dark Age. The Imperium's borders expanded again, but slowly, grudgingly, like scar tissue growing over a wound that refused to heal. By the end of M31, the Imperium had stabilized into the form it would maintain for the next 9,000 years. A galaxy-spanning theocracy administered by a vast and labyrinthine bureaucracy, defended by Space Marine chapters and the Imperial Guard, sustained by faith in a god who could no longer speak, and tithes extracted from a million worlds. The Administratum grew until it became indistinguishable from the Imperium itself. Entire hive spires were dedicated to record-keeping. Scribes spent lifetimes transcribing documents that no one would ever read. Planets were lost in clerical error, their coordinates misfiled, their tithes forgotten, their populations left to starve or fall to Xenos predation because a clerk 6 sectors away had transposed 2 digits in a shipping manifest. The Imperium did not govern efficiently, it governed exhaustively, and exhaustion, applied across 1,000,000 worlds, was sufficient to keep the machine lurching forward. The Adeptus Mechanicus calcified into fundamentalism. What had been desperate preservation of technology during Old Night became religious doctrine. The cult Mechanicus taught that machines had spirits, that the proper operation of technology required prayer as much as maintenance, that innovation was heresy, and the rediscovery of lost knowledge was the only acceptable form of progress. The tech priests hoarded their secrets. Forge worlds became fortresses of obscurantism, where knowledge was parceled out in fragments, where even the simplest repairs required rituals that took hours and incantations that no one understood. The Mechanicus preserved humanity's technology, but at the cost of ensuring humanity would never surpass it. Stagnation was canonized as virtue, and the ecclesiarchy rose. The imperial cult, which had begun as a grassroots movement in the wake of the heresy, became the state religion. The Adeptus Ministorum was founded to organize and enforce the worship of the God Emperor. Cathedrals were raised on every compliant world, structures so vast that entire cities existed within their naves. Cardinals became planetary governors, preachers became warlords, faith became the currency of imperial legitimacy. The ecclesiarchy taught that suffering was holy, that death in service to the emperor was the only true salvation, that the Imperium's endless wars were not tragedies but sacraments. Entire generations were raised to believe that their lives had no value except as fuel for the imperial war machine, and they went to their deaths singing hymns. It was grotesque, it was effective, and it held the Imperium together when reason would have allowed it to collapse. But the Imperium was not alone in the galaxy, and the enemies it faced were not content to wait. The Orcs had always been there. They were a remnant of the war in heaven, the devolved descendants of the Krork, biological weapons engineered by the Old Ones and left to fester in the ruins of ancient wars. The Orcs did not have a civilization. They had an infestation. They spread across the galaxy like spores, claiming systems not through conquest, but through sheer reproductive inevitability. Where one Orc died, a dozen more grew from the fungal matter of its corpse. The Orcs fought because fighting was what they were designed to do. They had no grand strategy, no long-term goals beyond the immediate satisfaction of violence. But they were inexhaustible. Every Orc warband defeated simply scattered into smaller warbands. Every warg crushed spawned 3 more in distant sectors. The Imperium could win every battle against the Orcs and still lose the war, because the Orcs did not need to win, they only needed to exist. The War of the Beast, in M32, proved this truth with brutal clarity. The largest Orc empire since the Great Crusade arose in the Ulanor system, led by a warlord whose size and intellect rivaled the Primarchs themselves. The Beast and his kin built weapons the Imperium could not match. Attack moons, gravity devices, teleportation technology that allowed entire armies to materialize inside imperial fortresses. The Orcs struck at Terra itself, and for the first time since the heresy, the cradle of mankind came under direct assault. The Imperium mobilized every available resource. The Imperial fists were nearly annihilated. The Adeptus Mechanicus deployed weapons from sealed vaults, relics so dangerous they had been forbidden since the Dark Age. The war dragged on for decades, and when the beast finally fell, it was not due to superior strategy, but attrition. The Imperium simply had more bodies to throw into the fire. The Orcs retreated, but they did not disappear. They never did. The Aldari were dying. Once, they had ruled the galaxy. For 10 million years, the Aldari had built an empire of such beauty and decadence that reality itself had bent to accommodate their desires. They had mastered the webway, psychic travel, and technologies the Imperium could only dream of reclaiming. They had lived in post-scarcity utopia, and in their arrogance, they had believed themselves eternal. They were wrong. The fall of the Aldari was not a war, it was a birth. The excesses of their civilization, the torture cults, the pleasure rites, The endless indulgence in sensation had fed something in the warp, a gestating god of excess, coalescing from the psychic runoff of an entire species' hedonism. When Slaanesh was born, it screamed, and the scream tore the galaxy apart. The Eye of Terror erupted. Trillions of Aeldari died in an instant, their souls devoured by the newborn Chaos God. The Aeldari Empire collapsed overnight. Those who survived did so by fleeing onto massive craft worlds, city ships large enough to house billions, or by retreating into the webway as Exodites or the sadistic Drukhari, who fed Slaanesh the souls of others to spare their own. The Aeldari who remained were shadows. They fought the Imperium not out of hatred, but desperation. Every engagement was a calculated risk, every life precious beyond measure, because their species teetered on the edge of extinction. They saw humanity as crude, wasteful, and monstrously fecund, spreading across the galaxy like a plague. They were not wrong, but neither was the Imperium inclined to care. The conflicts between the Imperium and the Aeldari were frequent but localized. Craft world warbands struck at Imperial colonies to retrieve ancient artifacts or spirit stones containing the souls of their dead. The Imperium responded with exterminatus, burning entire worlds to deny the Xenos their goals. There was no diplomacy, no negotiation, only the grinding attrition of species locked in a zero-sum struggle for survival. The Necrons slept. Beneath the surfaces of tomb worlds, scattered across the galaxy, the ancient conquerors of the war in heaven remained in stasis. Some tombs had failed, some had been plundered, but most endured, waiting for the command protocols to trigger, for the galaxy to become suitable for reclamation. In M41, they began to wake. The awakening was not coordinated. Some dynasties rose fully intact, their hierarchies preserved, their purpose clear. Others woke fragmented, their nobles mad from 60 million years of isolation, their warriors reduced to mindless automata. The Necrons did not announce themselves. They simply began reclaiming the systems they had once ruled, exterminating any species foolish enough to resist. The Imperium encountered the Necrons piecemeal, and each encounter was a revelation of terror. The Necrons did not bleed. They did not tire. Their weapons disintegrated matter at the atomic level. When destroyed, they phased out, teleporting back to tomb complexes to be rebuilt. They were not alive, and thus could not be killed in any meaningful sense. The Imperium classified them as Xenos. It was a vast understatement. The Necrons were not simply another threat. They were the galaxy's original rulers, returning to claim what they believed was theirs by right of conquest. And then the Tyranids arrived. They came from beyond the galactic rim, from the intergalactic void where no stars burned. The Tyranids were not a species. They were a force of nature, a biological apocalypse that consumed entire worlds and repurposed their biomass into more Tyranids. They traveled in hive fleets, vast swarms of bioships guided by a singular psychic consciousness that spanned light years. The first contact came in M41, when Hive Fleet Behemoth descended upon the eastern fringe. The Tyranids did not conquer, they devoured. Atmosphere, oceans, flora, fauna, and every sentient being on a planet were consumed, leaving behind barren rocks stripped of even microbial life. The Ultramarines met them at Macragge and won, but barely. Marneus Calgar, chapter master of the Ultramarines, fought a Carnifex in single combat and lost both his arms. The victory was Pyrrhic. Behemoth was only the first. Hive Fleet Kraken followed, then Leviathan, then dozens more, each one a fragment of a greater swarm encircling the galaxy like a noose. The Tyranids could not be negotiated with. They could not be reasoned with. They were hunger incarnate, and they would not stop until the galaxy was silent and consumed. The Imperium's response was the same as it had always been. Throw more bodies at the problem. Entire guard regiments were deployed to buy time. Worlds were evacuated or subjected to exterminatus to deny the Tyranids' biomass. The strategy was not sustainable, but sustainability had never been the Imperium's strength. The Tau emerged in M35, a young species in the eastern fringe who believed in something the Imperium had long since abandoned: progress. The Tau had developed faster-than-light travel, advanced technology, and a philosophy called the Greater Good, which preached unity and cooperation among species. They expanded slowly, offering vassalage to human worlds disillusioned with the Imperium's brutality. Some accepted. The Imperium responded with crusades, burning Tau colonies and executing human collaborators as traitors. The Tau were idealistic. They believed the galaxy could be united through reason and mutual benefit. They did not yet understand that the galaxy was not a place where idealism survived. The Imperium saw them as naive Xenos to be exterminated. The Tyranids saw them as biomass. The Orcs saw them as targets. The Tau endured, but their optimism was beginning to fray. The Inquisition grew into a shadow government. The organization Malcador had founded as a scalpel became a guillotine. Inquisitors operated with absolute authority, answerable to no one, empowered to declare entire worlds irredeemable and order their destruction. Some were zealots, purging populations for the faintest taint of heresy. Others were pragmatists, making deals with demons and Xenos to preserve the Imperium's survival. The Inquisition was not unified. Its three major orders, Hereticus, Xenos, and Malleus, often worked at cross purposes, pursuing agendas that conflicted as often as they aligned. Radical inquisitors used forbidden technology and chaos artifacts, believing the ends justified the means. Puritan inquisitors executed radicals as heretics. The Inquisition's internal civil wars were as brutal as any Xenos threat. But they were necessary. The Imperium was rotting from within. Chaos cults spread through the underhives. Gene-stealer infestations prepared worlds for Tyranid consumption. Demonic possession was a constant threat. The Inquisition held the line, and if their methods were monstrous, it was because the threats they faced left no room for mercy. The Black Crusades punctuated the millennia like funeral bells. Abaddon the Despoiler, Warmaster of Chaos, launched 13 crusades from the Eye of Terror across 10,000 years. Each was a galaxy-spanning invasion, and each was repelled at horrific cost. The Imperium learned to dread the opening of the Cadian Gate, the stable corridor of space that allowed fleets to exit the Eye without being lost to warp storms. Cadia became the linchpin. The fortress world stood watch over the Eye, its pylons ancient Necron structures stabilizing reality and preventing the Eye from expanding. Cadia endured siege after siege, and every time it held. The planet's defenders adopted a motto that became legendary: Cadia stands. But Abaddon was patient, and with each Black Crusade, he learned. The Age of Apostasy, in M36, nearly destroyed the Imperium from within. Gog Vandir, High Lord of Terror and Ecclesiarch of the Adeptus Ministorum, declared himself the voice of the Emperor and ruled the Imperium as a tyrant. His reign of blood lasted for decades, enforced by the Brides of the Emperor, an all-female military order that would later become the Adepta Sororitas. Vandir purged rivals, executed dissenters, and plunged the Imperium into civil war. The Space Marines, forbidden from interfering in imperial politics by ancient compact, watched in frustration as the Imperium tore itself apart. It was not until the Adeptus Custodes intervened, bringing the leader of the Brides before the Golden Throne, that the truth was revealed. The Emperor, through some unknown means, communicated his will. Vandir was executed. The reign of blood ended. The Adepta Sororitas, the Sisters of Battle, were founded from the ashes of Vandir's regime. They became the militant arm of the ecclesiarchy, warriors of faith armed with bolters and flamers, wielding their belief in the Emperor as both shield and weapon. They burned heretics with righteous fury, and their zeal was unmatched even among the Space Marines. The Imperium endured. It always endured, not because it was strong, but because it was vast, because it could lose 1,000 worlds and still have 1,000,000 more, because it measured victory not in territory held, but in how long it could keep the fires burning. The Imperium was a civilization that had weaponized its own decay, turning stagnation into doctrine, exhaustion into sacrament. 10,000 years passed, and the Imperium did not change. It could not change. Change was heresy, innovation was corruption. The only acceptable path was to repeat what had been done before, over and over, praying that the rituals would hold and the walls would not crumble for one more day. And across the galaxy, the enemies of mankind grew stronger. The Orcs multiplied, the Tyranids drew closer, the Necrons awakened. Chaos festered in the Eye of Terror, waiting for the moment when the Imperium's defenses would finally crack. That moment was coming. The long decay was ending, not because the Imperium had grown stronger, but because the galaxy had grown tired of waiting. The fortress had stood for 10,000 years. Cadia was not simply a world, it was a declaration, a line drawn in the void, daring the forces of chaos to cross it. The planet stood sentinel over the Cadian Gate, the only stable corridor through which fleets could emerge from the Eye of Terror without being lost to the madness of the warp. Necron pylons, ancient and imperfectly understood, dotted the surface, their presence anchoring reality itself, preventing the Eye from expanding beyond its borders. The people of Cadia were born with weapons in their hands. Every citizen was a soldier. Every child learned to field strip a lasgun before they learned to read. The planet's defense force was the most disciplined, the most experienced, the most unyielding in the Imperium. Cadian regiments were deployed across the galaxy, their reputation for steadfastness legendary, but the homeworld remained, always watching the Eye, always ready. Cadia had survived 12 Black Crusades. Abaddon the Despoiler had thrown fleets and armies against it, and each time the fortress had held. The defenders grew proud. They adopted a saying that spread across the Imperium like a prayer: Cadia stands. It was faith, it was truth, and it was about to become a lie. Abaddon had learned patience. The War Master of Chaos was no longer the impetuous first captain who had seized Horus's body and fled into the Eye. 10,000 years in the warp had changed him. Time moved strangely there, and Abaddon had endured centuries of warfare, politics, and the grinding attrition of holding together a coalition of warbands and legions who hated each other almost as much as they hated the Imperium. The first 12 Black Crusades had not been failures. They had been preparation. Each crusade had secured something: a weapon, a relic, a position. Abaddon had not been trying to conquer the Imperium. He had been assembling the tools he needed to shatter it. The 13th Black Crusade was not a raid. It was the culmination of 10 millennia of planning. Abaddon intended to destroy Cadia, collapse the pylons, and tear open the Cadian Gate so wide that the Eye of Terror would consume the Imperium like a cancer. The armada that emerged from the Eye in 999, M41, was the largest Chaos fleet since the Heresy. Hundreds of warships, some of them ancient relics from the Great Crusade, others twisted by the warp into shapes that defied description. Daemon engines screamed through the void. Planetary assault barges carried millions of Chaos cultists, traitor guard regiments, and the corrupted remnants of once loyal Astartes. The legions had come in force. The Black Legion, the Word-Bearers, the Iron Warriors, the Night Lords, and fragments of every traitor legion that had survived the long centuries. And at the head of the armada, Abaddon stood aboard the vengeful spirit the flagship Horus had once commanded, now defiled beyond recognition. The War Master wore the Talon of Horus on one hand and the daemon sword Drachnian in the other. He had claimed the title his predecessor had borne, and he intended to finish what Horus had started. Cadia mobilized. Lord Castellan Ursakar Creed, commander of Cadia's defense, was a tactical genius. He had fought off countless incursions, repelled raids, and held the line when others would have broken. Creed coordinated the defense from Qasr Galan, the fortress city that served as the planet's command center. He deployed the Cadian shock troops with precision, fortified the pylons, and called for reinforcements from across the segmentum. The Imperium responded. Space Marine chapters descended upon Cadia. The Black Templars, ever crusading, arrived in force. The Crimson Fists, still rebuilding from near annihilation centuries prior, committed their remaining brothers. The Ultramarines sent task forces. The Imperial Guard deployed regiments by the hundreds, and the Imperial Navy mustered every battleship that could reach the system. And others came, drawn by forces the Imperium could not command. Saint Celestine manifested above Cadia, a living saint wreathed in golden fire, wings of light spreading from her shoulders. She had died and been resurrected countless times, a soul bound so tightly to the Emperor's will that death could not hold her. She descended upon the battlefield like a comet, her blade cutting through traitors and demons alike, her presence a beacon of faith that rallied the defenders. Belisarius Cole, Archmagos of the Adeptus Mechanicus, arrived aboard the Zar Quaesitor, a warship older than some imperial worlds. Cole was ancient, his body more machine than flesh, his mind augmented with cogitators and neural wetware. He had lived for 10,000 years, forbidden by Robert Guilliman to reveal his greatest work until the time was right. Cole saw Cadia's defense as an opportunity to field-test weapons and secure relics that the Mechanicus had long sought. Trazyn the Infinite, Necron overlord and collector of galactic curiosities, arrived for reasons that defied mortal understanding. Trazyn was not a conqueror, he was a curator. His tomb world, Solemnace, housed a collection of artifacts, creatures, and beings preserved in stasis fields. Trazyn saw the galaxy as a museum, and he had no intention of allowing chaos to destroy pieces of his collection. He deployed portions of his forces, including stasis-locked specimens he released as weapons to stem the tide. Imperial commanders who found themselves fighting alongside Necron warriors questioned reality itself, but Trazyn cared nothing for their confusion. He had investments to protect. The battle for Cadia became a meat grinder. The Chaos fleets hammered the orbital defenses. Battleships dueled in the void, their broadsides tearing through armor plating, their crews dying by the thousands as compartments vented into space. The Imperial Navy gave ground slowly, fighting delaying actions, sacrificing ships to buy time for reinforcements. The Chaos fleets pushed forward, relentless, and the sky above Cadia became a graveyard of burning metal. On the surface, the war devolved into brutal attrition. The traitors landed in force, deploying across Cadia's surface in a coordinated assault that struck at every major casa simultaneously. The Cadian regiments held their ground, fighting from fortified positions, calling down artillery strikes on enemy concentrations. The Space Marines deployed where the fighting was thickest, their presence turning the tide of battles that would have been lost without them. But the enemy was inexhaustible. For every cultist killed, 10 more emerged from drop pods. For every daemon banished, another clawed its way into reality, through the thinning warp barrier. The traitor Astartes fought with a ferocity born of 10,000 years of hatred, and the Chaos gods blessed their champions with mutations and demonic gifts. The pylons became focal points of the war. The Necron structures that stabilized reality were ancient, their mechanisms understood only in fragments. The traitors sought to destroy them, the Imperials sought to defend them. Battles raged around the pylons, and the ground became saturated with blood and promethium. The word-bearers conducted rituals to corrupt the pylons, turning them into conduits for warp energy. The Iron Warriors besieged them with methodical precision, deploying siege engines and calculating firing solutions with cold efficiency. Lord Castellan Creed coordinated the defense with brilliance. He rotated regiments to prevent exhaustion, deployed reserves at critical moments, and maintained supply lines under constant bombardment. His strategic acumen became legendary. Guardsmen spoke of how Creed could hide entire tank battalions in positions the enemy never anticipated, how his orders always seemed to arrive at the exact moment they were needed. But even genius has limits. The Imperium was losing. Not quickly, not decisively, but the trajectory was clear. The Chaos forces kept coming. The Imperials were running out of soldiers, ammunition, and hope. The pylons were falling, one by one, their destruction marked by reality fracturing, by warp rifts opening and demons pouring through. Abaddon had brought something the Imperium could not counter. The Will of Eternity, a Blackstone fortress, emerged from the Eye of Terror. The Blackstone fortresses were relics of the war in heaven, massive space stations of unknowable origin and terrible power. They could manipulate gravitational fields, generate energy beams capable of destroying planets, and serve as weapons of mass annihilation. Abaddon had claimed one during the Gothic War centuries prior, and he had spent those centuries learning to wield it. The Will of Eternity descended toward Cadia. The Imperial Navy threw everything at it. Battleships launched suicide runs, ramming the fortress, detonating their reactors in desperate attempts to damage it. The fortress's shields held, its weapons carved through Imperial ships like a blade through parchment. The defense fleet was annihilated, and the Will of Eternity entered Cadia's atmosphere, a mountain of ancient technology blotting out the sky. Lord Castellan Creed stood atop the walls of Casser Gallen and watched the fortress descend. He gave the order to evacuate what could be evacuated, to fight to the last, to ensure that even in death, Cadia would exact a price from the enemy. Abaddon rammed the Will of Eternity into Cadia's surface. The impact was apocalyptic. The fortress struck with the force of an extinction-level asteroid, punching through the crust, shattering tectonic plates, igniting the planet's mantle. The remaining pylons overloaded, their mechanisms unable to compensate for the catastrophic disruption. Reality screamed. The planet cracked. Cadia did not explode in a single cataclysmic detonation. It broke, slowly, horribly. Massive fissures opened across the surface, swallowing Kassa's whole. Magma erupted in geysers that reached the lower atmosphere. The sky turned red, then black, then a sickening green as the warp bled through the fractures. The defenders fought on. Even as the world died beneath them, the Cadians held their positions. Guardsmen fired lasguns at traitors even as the ground collapsed beneath their feet. Space Marines held the line at shattered pylons, buying time for evacuations that were never going to save everyone. Saint Celestine manifested again and again, dying and resurrecting, her light a defiant flicker against the encroaching dark. Lord Castellan Creed refused evacuation. He remained at Kasser Gallen, directing the defense until the very end. The Kasser fell, buried beneath collapsing infrastructure and traitor assaults. Creed's last orders were transmitted. Even as the walls came down, his fate remains unknown. Some say he was taken by Trazyn the Infinite, preserved in a stasis field as another curiosity for the Collector's vault. Others believe he died with his city, refusing to abandon his post. Cadia shattered. The planet broke into fragments, its surface rendered uninhabitable, its atmosphere vented into space. Millions died, billions. The evacuation saved a fraction. Cadian regiments were scattered across the segmentum, their homeworld gone, their purpose transformed from defense to vengeance. But the worst was yet to come. The pylons were destroyed. The anchors holding reality stable were gone, and without them, the Eye of Terror metastasized. The Eye had been a wound in space for 10,000 years, a scar left by the birth of Slanesh. It had been contained, held in check by the pylons and the vigilance of Cadia's defenders. With the pylons shattered, there was nothing to stop it from expanding. The Great Rift tore open. It was not a gradual expansion, it was an eruption, a cascade of warp energy that ripped across the galaxy like a scream given form. The rift stretched from the Eye of Terror to the Hadex anomaly on the eastern fringe, a jagged wound billions of light years long, splitting the galaxy in two. On one side, Imperium Sanctus, the half of the Imperium still within reach of the Astronomicon, still able to navigate the warp with some semblance of reliability. On the other side, Imperium Nihilus, the dark half, cut off from Terra, cut off from the Emperor's light, alone in the void with enemies on every side and no hope of reinforcement. Warp storms raged across the rift. Ships that entered were lost, consumed by demons, or thrown across time and space. Entire sectors went silent, their astropathic communications severed. Worlds that had never seen chaos found themselves besieged by demonic incursions as reality thinned to the point where the immaterium bled through without invitation. The galaxy had not ended, but it had broken. Abaddon stood upon the ruins of Cadia and looked upon his work. The War Master of Chaos had succeeded where Horus had failed. He had not conquered Terra, he had not slain the Emperor, but he had shattered the Imperium's cohesion. He had turned the galaxy into a battleground where chaos could walk freely, where the great game of the ruinous powers could be played without restraint. The 13th Black Crusade had not ended, it had simply changed theaters. Abaddon's fleets pushed deeper into the Imperium, claiming systems, burning worlds, leaving ruin in their wake. The Black Legion grew as warbands rallied to the War Master's banner, drawn by the promise of plunder and the favor of the gods. The Imperium reeled. High Lords on Terra scrambled to understand the scale of the disaster. Half the Imperium was cut off, communication was sporadic. Entire segmentums were on their own, forced to defend themselves without reinforcement, without supplies, without hope of relief. The Administratum's bureaucracy, already slow and labyrinthine, ground to a near halt as clerks tried to account for worlds that no longer responded to astropathic hails. The ecclesiarchy preached that the Great Rift was a test of faith, that the Emperor was judging his followers and only the faithful would endure. It was propaganda. It was also true enough to be believed. And in the darkness of Imperium Nihilus, isolated worlds looked to the stars and saw only the void staring back. Cadia had fallen, but the Cadians had not. Scattered across the galaxy, the survivors of Cadia's defense regrouped. They joined new regiments, reinforced beleaguered garrisons, and carried with them a new creed. Cadia stands. Not because the planet still existed, but because the idea endured. The defenders had not broken. They had simply moved the fight elsewhere. The fall of Cadia was not the end. It was a punctuation mark, a moment when the Imperium learned that survival was no longer a matter of holding the line. The line was gone. The galaxy had split. And the wars that followed would be fought not for victory, but for the right to exist one more day. The long decay had ended. The age of the Dark Imperium had begun. And in the warp, the Chaos Gods laughed, because every scream of despair, every prayer of desperation, every act of violence fed them. The Great Rift was not a defeat for Chaos, it was a feast. And the galaxy, fractured and bleeding, would nourish them for aeons. Cadia had stood for 10,000 years, and when it fell, it took the galaxy's hope with it. The Garden had claimed Ultramar, not slowly, not with the creeping inevitability of decay, but with the sudden totality of a plague unleashed with purpose. Mortarion had returned, and he had brought the gifts of Nurgle with him. The Death Guard descended upon the 500 worlds like a pestilence given form, and where they walked, paradise rotted into nightmare. Ultramar had been the jewel of the Imperium. 500 worlds governed with efficiency and vision, their populations prosperous by imperial standards, their infrastructure maintained, their culture still bearing the stamp of Robert Guilliman's philosophy. It was not perfect. No place in the Imperium was perfect, but it was as close as humanity came to the dream of the Great Crusade, ordered, productive, and enduring. Mortarion despised it. The Daemon Primarch of the Death Guard had spent 10,000 years in the warp, his body transformed by Nurgle's blessings into a monument to decay. His wings were tattered membranes. His skin was corpse-pale and bloated with rot. He breathed pestilence, and his scythe, silence, reaped souls with the patience of entropy itself. Mortarion had become everything he had once hated, a wielder of sorcery, a servant of gods, a thing of the warp, but he had also found peace in his damnation. Nurgle had given Mortarion what the Emperor never had, acceptance. The Plague God did not demand perfection. He embraced failure. He celebrated decay. In Nurgle's garden, nothing truly died. It simply changed, rotting into new forms, feeding the cycle of rebirth and corruption. Mortarion, who had endured a lifetime of suffering on Barbarous and 10,000 years of bitterness in the eye, had found something resembling contentment in the bosom of the Lord of Decay. And now he would share that gift with his brother. The Plague Wars began with biological warfare on a scale the Imperium had not seen since the Istvan atrocity. The Death Guard deployed plague engines, vast daemon machines that belched toxic fumes into planetary atmospheres. Contagion spread through the populations of Ultramar's worlds, diseases engineered to defy every medical countermeasure the apothecaries could devise. Nurgle's rot consumed flesh, turning the living into shambling plague-bearers. The walking pox transformed citizens into vectors, spreading infection faster than quarantine measures could contain it. Hive cities became necropolises, agri-worlds withered, their crops turned to slime. Garden worlds, terraformed over millennia, became fetid swamps where reality itself grew sick. The Ultramarines responded with fire and quarantine, burning entire cities to ash to contain the spread, executing the infected before they could become plague zombies. It was not enough. Mortarion had learned patience. The Death Guard did not rush. They besieged, they waited, they allowed the plagues to do the work, knowing that time was on their side. Every day the Ultramarines spent fighting disease was a day they were not fighting the Death Guard. Every world that fell to plague was one less world the Imperium could defend. Robert Guilliman fought his brother's war with the tools he had: logistics, discipline, and the grim calculus of acceptable losses. The Lord Commander of the Imperium had awoken to find his realm in ruins, and Ultramar's desecration was personal. These were his worlds, his people. The legacy he had built across 500 worlds was being drowned in filth, and the architect of that destruction was his own brother. Guilliman deployed the Ultramarines and their successors in coordinated strikes, hitting Death Guard positions with overwhelming force before withdrawing. He evacuated worlds that could not be saved, moving populations to fortified systems. He authorized exterminatus on planets where the infection had spread beyond containment, killing billions to save trillions, and he hated every moment of it. Guilliman had never been a butcher. He was a statesman, an administrator, a primarch who believed in building rather than destroying. The plague wars forced him to make choices he had spent 10,000 years in stasis dreaming he would never have to face again. Every world he burned was a failure. Every city he sacrificed was a betrayal of the ideals he had tried to instill in the Imperium. But Mortarion gave him no choice. The two primarchs met in battle above Ajax, the garden world that had once been Ultramar's paradise. Ajax had been beautiful, rolling fields, crystal rivers, forests that stretched across continents. The Death Guard had turned it into a swamp of disease. The atmosphere was choked with spores. The ground was saturated with filth. Daemon engines the size of hab blocks waded through the muck, belching plague into the sky. Guilliman descended to the surface with his honor guard, determined to drive Mortarion from the world personally. The armor of fate, a relic suit of power armor gifted by the Yennari, protected him from the worst of the contagion. The Emperor's sword, a blade ignited with the Emperor's own fire, cut through plague marines and demons alike. But Mortarion was a Daemon Primarch, elevated by a god. Guilliman was only a man. They fought in the ruins of a city that had once housed millions. Mortarion swung silence, and Guilliman parried with the Emperor's sword. The blade burned with holy fire, searing Mortarion's flesh. But the Daemon Primarch laughed. Pain was nothing. Suffering was sacrament. Mortarion had endured worse, and he would endure this. Guilliman struck again and again, each blow precise, calculated, but he was tiring. Mortarion was not. The Daemon Primarch pressed forward, his scythe carving through the air, forcing Guilliman back. And then the Emperor intervened. From the Golden Throne, across the vast distance between Terra and Ajax, the Emperor reached out. It was not a conscious decision. The Emperor was beyond thought in any conventional sense. His mind burned down to a singular purpose, sustaining the Astronomicon, holding the Webway Gate closed, enduring. But some fragment of will, some sliver of awareness, recognized that his son was in danger. The Emperor's sword blazed, not with ordinary fire, but with the Emperor's own essence. The blade became a conduit, a weapon of pure psychic fury, and when Guilliman struck Mortarion, the blow did not simply wound. It banished. Mortarion screamed as the Emperor's fire seared his demonic form, unmaking portions of his essence, forcing him to retreat into the warp before the blade could erase him entirely. Mortarion fled. But he did not consider it defeat. He had proven that even Guilliman, the Emperor's last loyal son, could be pushed to the brink. The plague wars were far from over. Guilliman stood in the ruins, his armor cracked, his body trembling with exhaustion, and he looked upon the Emperor's sword with something between gratitude and horror. The Emperor had saved him, but the weapon that had done so was not a gift, it was a leash, a reminder that Guilliman, for all his independence, was still a tool, still a servant, still bound to the will of a father who could no longer speak but who could still reach across the galaxy to enforce his designs. Guilliman had wanted to believe that the Emperor was still the man he remembered, the vision he had carried through 10,000 years of stasis. The revelation that the Emperor was something else now, something vast, terrible, and alien, was a wound that no apothecary could heal. But Guilliman did what he always did. He endured, he gave orders, he rebuilt, and he did not speak of what he had felt when the Emperor's fire had coursed through the blade. Ultramar was scarred. Entire worlds had been rendered uninhabitable. The 500 worlds were reduced to dozens that could still support life without extensive terraforming. The Death Guard retreated, but they did not leave. They lingered at the borders of Ultramar, raiding, spreading plague, a constant reminder that Mortarion could return whenever he chose. The plague wars had been a draw. Neither side had won. Guilliman had prevented total annihilation, but he had not driven Mortarion from the realm. Mortarion had failed to kill his brother, but he had inflicted wounds that would take centuries to heal. And beneath Terra, another war raged in silence. The Webway had always been a wound. Magnus the Red, in his desperation to warn the Emperor of Horus's betrayal, had shattered the barriers protecting the Imperial Webway project. The Emperor had been building a network of tunnels through the Webway, a means of bypassing the warp entirely, freeing humanity from reliance on navigators and the whims of chaos. The project had been the Emperor's greatest work, the key to his vision of a secular, rational Imperium. Magnus had destroyed it. The breach had allowed demons to pour into the tunnels beneath the Imperial Palace. The Emperor, already weakened from creating the Primarchs and sustaining the Astronomicon, had been forced to sit upon the Golden Throne, burning his psychic might to hold the gate closed. For 10,000 years, the war in the Webway had continued, a conflict fought in absolute secrecy by the Adeptus Custodes and the Sisters of Silence. The Custodians were the Emperor's personal guard, gene-forged to be superior even to Space Marines, each one a work of art rather than mass production. They numbered in the thousands, not millions, and they had been designed to protect the Emperor, not wage wars of attrition. But they fought anyway, holding the line in the dark tunnels where demons clawed at the gate. The Sisters of Silence fought alongside them, the anathema Psychana, pariahs, blanks, women born without souls, whose very presence nullified the warp, banishing demons and rendering psychers powerless. They were anathema to everything the warp represented, and in the tunnels, they were the Imperium's most effective weapon. But the war was endless. For every daemon banished, another emerged. The gate could not be closed. The Emperor's presence on the throne was the only thing holding it from collapsing entirely, and if the gate fell, daemons would pour directly into the Imperial Palace. Terra itself would become a daemon world, and the Imperium would fall overnight. The Custodians fought with the knowledge that they could never win, only endure. Captain General Trajan Valoris, leader of the Adeptus Custodes, walked the tunnels daily, inspecting the defenses, coordinating the eternal vigil. He knew every inch of the webway beneath Terra. He knew the places where reality was thinnest. He knew the names of demons that had been banished 100 times and returned 101, and he knew that the Emperor was changing. The Golden Throne was not simply a life support system, it was a psychic amplifier, channeling the Emperor's will across the galaxy. But 10,000 years of burning had transformed the Emperor into something no longer entirely human. His psychic presence had grown vast, so immense that it distorted the warp itself. Some claimed the Emperor was becoming a god, not through worship, though the ecclesiarchy certainly provided that, but through sheer psychic magnitude. The Emperor's thoughts, if they could still be called thoughts, were alien. When the Custodians stood in his presence, they felt not comfort, but terror. The Emperor was still defending humanity, but he was no longer the man who had walked among them. He was a force of nature, a psychic sun burning in the warp, and no one could say with certainty whether he still remembered what he had been trying to protect. Valoris kept these observations to himself. To speak them aloud would be heresy. To acknowledge them would be to admit that the Imperium's foundation, the belief that the Emperor still guided them, was built on a lie. But Valoris was not blind. He saw the truth, and he did what Custodians always did. He stood watch, and he did not falter. The war in the webway continued. The Harlequins, the enigmatic warrior performers of the Aldari, sometimes appeared in the tunnels, fighting demons alongside the Custodians without explanation. They spoke in riddles and vanished as quickly as they arrived. Valoris did not trust them, but he did not refuse their aid. The enemy of chaos was, if not a friend, at least useful. And in the deepest tunnels, where the gate itself stood, the Emperor's psychic presence was overwhelming. The air shimmered with energy, the walls bled light. Custodians who ventured too close reported visions, glimpses of futures that might be, of wars yet to come, of a galaxy consumed by fire or silence. Some claimed the Emperor was showing them the path forward. Others believed the visions were simply byproducts of his unraveling mind. No one knew for certain. The Emperor did not speak. He only burned. The Plague Wars and the War in the Webway were not separate conflicts. They were symptoms of the same disease, the Imperium's slow collapse. Guilliman fought Mortarion in the Materium, while the Custodians fought demons in the Immaterium, and both wars were unwinnable. Both were simply holding actions, buying time for an Imperium that no longer had a future, only an extended present. Guilliman returned to Terra after the Plague Wars and requested an audience with the Emperor. He was granted entry to the Sanctum Imperialis, the chamber where the Golden Throne stood. Custodians flanked him as he walked the vast hall, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The Emperor sat enthroned, his body a skeletal ruin wrapped in gold and machinery, his psychic presence so overwhelming that even Guilliman, a Primarch, felt small. Guilliman knelt. He had questions. He wanted to know if the Emperor approved of his actions, if the Codex had been the right choice, if the Imperium he was trying to save was worth saving. The Emperor did not speak. What Guilliman felt instead was a presence, vast, cold, judgmental, not malevolent, but utterly indifferent to Guilliman's doubts or pain. The Emperor was not a father anymore. He was a god, burning with purpose, and that purpose did not include comfort. Guilliman left the Sanctum Imperialis with the understanding that he was alone. The Emperor had saved him on Ajax, but it had not been love. It had been utility. Guilliman was a tool, and tools that broke were discarded. The Lord Commander returned to his duties with the knowledge that the Imperium's survival rested on his shoulders, and his alone. The Emperor would sustain the Astronomicon. The custodians would hold the gate. But the wars of the Materium, the governance, the endless triage, that was Guilliman's burden, and he would carry it, because there was no one else. The Plague Wars had ended in stalemate. The war in the Webway continued in silence. And the Imperium, fractured and bleeding, ground forward into the dark, sustained not by hope, but by the sheer refusal to stop. The light went out, not slowly, not with warning. The Astronomicon, the psychic lighthouse that had guided humanity's ships through the warp for 10,000 years, simply ceased to exist for half the galaxy. The Great Rift had split the Imperium in two, and on the far side of that wound, in the half now called Imperium Nihilus, the Emperor's light could not reach. Navigators went blind. Their third eyes, organs evolved to perceive the Astronomicon and chart courses through the warp, saw only darkness. Ships that attempted warp travel without the light emerged centuries off course, or not at all. Entire fleets were lost, their wreckage scattered across dimensions that had no name. The warp routes that had connected the Imperium collapsed, and the worlds of Imperium Nihilus found themselves isolated, cut off from terror, from reinforcement, from hope. The dark half of the galaxy became a graveyard lit only by funeral pyres. And yet, humanity endured, because humanity always endured. The worlds of Imperium Nihilus did not surrender. They could not afford to. Orc empires pressed from every direction. Tyrannid hive fleets descended without warning, consuming entire systems before distress signals could be sent. Chaos warbands, emboldened by the Great Rift, claimed systems and built dark fortresses. The Drukhari raided with impunity, stealing souls to feed their dying god, and the Necrons, waking from their long sleep, saw opportunity in the Imperium's fracture. The defenders adapted, they fought, they died, and when they died, others took their place. Commander Dante, Chapter Master of the Blood Angels, was named Regent of Imperium Nihilus. It was a symbolic title. Dante commanded no fleets, he controlled no bureaucracy. The Administratum on Terra could not reach him, and he could not reach them. But Robert Guilliman, before the rift had severed all communication, had bestowed the title upon him, recognizing that the dark half of the Imperium needed a leader, and Dante was the only one with the experience and respect to bear the weight. Dante was the oldest living space marine. Over 1,500 years of service to the Emperor, he had fought in campaigns that were legend. He had led the defense of Baal against Hive Fleet Leviathan, standing upon the walls of his chapter's home world as the Tyrannids descended in numbers that blotted out the stars. He had endured, he always endured, but Dante was tired. The weight of centuries pressed upon him. He had outlived brothers, friends, and entire generations of blood angels. The black rage, the curse that afflicted his chapter, haunted him. Every battle risked, triggering the madness that turned Astartes into frothing berserkers who believed themselves sanguineous, reliving the Primarch's final moments aboard the vengeful spirit. Dante had resisted the rage for over a millennium, but he felt it lurking at the edges of his mind, waiting for the moment when exhaustion would finally overcome discipline. He had prayed for death, for release, for the Emperor to grant him rest. Instead, he had been given an entire half of the galaxy to defend. Dante accepted the burden because refusal was not an option. He gathered what forces he could, coordinating with other chapters, guard regiments, and planetary defense forces. He established strongholds in key systems, fortified worlds that could serve as rallying points. He fought not for victory, but for survival. buying time in the hope that eventually the rift would close and the Imperium would be whole again. It was a forlorn hope, but hope was all that remained. The Indomitus Crusade had pushed into Imperium Nihilus in the years following the Great Rift's opening, led by Robert Guilliman himself. The Primarch had deployed the Primaris Space Marines, reinforcing beleaguered chapters, reclaiming lost worlds, and establishing supply lines. For a time, it had seemed that the dark half might be stabilized. But the Crusade could not remain forever. Guilliman had returned to Imperium Sanctus, leaving Dante and the defenders to hold what had been reclaimed. The withdrawal had been a quiet betrayal, necessary perhaps, but a betrayal nonetheless. The defenders of Imperium Nihilus understood that they had been written off, that the Imperium's resources were finite, and that the light half took priority. They were expendable, acceptable losses in the calculus of galactic survival. They fought anyway. The Blood Angels led the defense of the Baal system, their fortress monastery, a bastion against the encroaching dark. Successor chapters rallied to Dante's banner, the flesh-tearers, the blood-drinkers, the lamenters, whose luck was so cursed that even their allies questioned their presence. Together, they formed the Shield of Baal, a coalition dedicated to holding the eastern fringe against the Tyranids. The Tyranids were relentless. Hive Fleet Leviathan, the largest Tyranid swarm ever encountered, had descended upon the galaxy from beneath the galactic plane. Its tendrils stretched across hundreds of systems, consuming biomass, adapting to every defense the Imperium deployed. The Blood Angels had faced Leviathan before, during the defense of Baal, and they had won, barely. The victory had cost them thousands of battle brothers, and the wounds had not healed. Now, Leviathan was returning, not as a single unified swarm, but as dozens of splinter fleets, each one probing for weakness, testing defenses, adapting to resistance. The Tyranids did not need to win quickly. They simply needed to outlast the defenders, and time was on their side. Dante coordinated the defense with the grim efficiency of someone who had seen every form of warfare the galaxy could inflict. He deployed rapid response forces to intercept splinter fleets before they could make planetfall. He authorized exterminatus on worlds that could not be held, denying the Tyranids biomass. He rationed gene seed, knowing that every fallen Blood Angel was irreplaceable, that the chapter's future hung by a thread. And he fought personally, leading from the front, because he had never learned how to do otherwise. But the Tyranids were not the only threat. Chaos warbands poured through the Great Rift, claiming systems in Imperium Nihilus with the fervor of conquerors who believed the galaxy was theirs for the taking. The Death Guard established plague gardens on conquered worlds. The Thousand Suns built sorcerous libraries where reality bent to their will. The World Eaters descended like locusts, killing everything in their path because the Butcher's Nails demanded it. And the Black Legion, Abaddon's chosen, pushed deeper into the dark half, claiming fortresses and resources, preparing for wars yet unnamed. The defenders fought on every front, and won nowhere decisively. Then the Necrons unveiled the Pariah Nexus. It began in the Nephilim subsector, a cluster of systems near the galactic core. Imperial forces reported strange phenomena, psychers collapsing, screaming that the warp had gone silent. Astropaths dying as their connection to the Immaterium was severed. Daemons vanishing spontaneously, their presence in real space unsustainable. The Imperium sent investigation fleets. They did not return. What had happened was something the Imperium had no context for. The Necrons had activated ancient pylons across the Nephilim subsector, devices that projected a null field over an area of space spanning dozens of light years. The pylons were technology from the War in Heaven, designed to sever the connection between real space and the warp, rendering psychers inert and demons impossible. The Pariah Nexus was a zone of space where the warp did not exist. For the Imperium, it was catastrophic. Psychers were the Imperium's backbone. Astropaths transmitted messages. Navigators guided ships. Sanctioned psychers fought alongside the Imperial Guard, wielding the warp as a weapon. In the Pariah Nexus, all of them were rendered useless. Worse, they died. The sudden cessation of their connection to the warp was fatal, their minds unable to adapt to the silence. But for the Necrons, the Nexus was paradise. The Silent King, Sarek, had returned from his self-imposed exile beyond the galactic rim. He had departed 60 million years ago, fleeing into the void after the biotransference had damned his people, seeking redemption or forgetting. He had found neither. But he had seen something that changed his purpose. The Tyranids, the hive fleets, were devouring the galaxy, and the Necrons, soulless and unliving, were immune to consumption but not to extinction. If the Tyranids consumed all biomass, the galaxy would be a barren wasteland, devoid of the life the Necrons needed to one day reverse the biotransference and reclaim their flesh. Zarek returned with a plan: reclaim the galaxy, exterminate the lesser species, and prepare the Necrons for a war against the Tyranids that would determine the fate of all existence. The Pariah Nexus was the first step. By expanding the null zones, the Necrons could render entire regions of space inhospitable to the warp-dependent species. The Imperium would collapse, chaos would starve, the Eldari would wither. Only the Necrons, who had no connection to the warp, would thrive. Zarek deployed his forces with cold precision. Tomb worlds awoke across the Nephilim subsector, disgorging legions of Necron warriors, immortals, and war constructs. The Sartek dynasty led the assault, their overlords coordinating with the efficiency of a species that had waged war across aeons. The Imperium responded with everything it had. The Indomitus Crusade fleets that had been operating in the region redirected to the Nephilim subsector, the Ultramarines, the Imperial Fists, and a dozen other chapters deployed in force. The Sisters of Battle, immune to the Pariah Nexus's effects because they wielded faith rather than psychic power, became invaluable assets. The Adeptus Mechanicus deployed Skitarii and Titan legions, their augmented soldiers less affected by the null field than baseline humans. But the Imperium was fighting blind. Without astropaths, communication between fleets required physical couriers, ships that jumped between systems to relay orders. Without navigators, warp travel became suicidal. Ships that entered the warp within the Pariah Nexus emerged light years off course, if they emerged at all. The Imperium's logistics, already strained, collapsed entirely. The Necrons pressed the advantage. They did not fight like the Imperium. They did not hold territory for its own sake. They struck at strategic targets, destroying infrastructure, severing supply lines, and withdrawing before the Imperium could mount a counterattack. When Imperial forces did engage them, the Necrons phased out when destroyed, teleporting back to their tomb complexes to be rebuilt. It was a war of attrition, and the Necrons were winning. The Silent King himself took the field, a figure of cold majesty clad in necrodermis and wielding the scythe of the Nightbringer, a weapon forged from a shard of the shattered star god. He commanded his forces with the authority of a being who had ruled the galaxy once before and intended to do so again. But Zarek was not without opposition among his own kind. The Necron dynasties were fractious. Some overlords acknowledged Zarek's authority. Others rejected it, pursuing their own agendas. The Sartek dynasty followed the Silent King. The Mephrid dynasty sought to reclaim their lost glory through conquest. The Novok dynasty waged war for the joy of killing, their madness a byproduct of the biotransference's imperfections. The Necrons were united in their goal of reclaiming the galaxy, but divided in how to achieve it. And that division was the only reason the Imperium had not already been exterminated. The war for the Pariah Nexus became a grinding stalemate. The Imperium could not push the Necrons back, but the Necrons could not expand the Nexus fast enough to render the region uninhabitable. Every pylon destroyed was replaced. Every Necron overlord slain was resurrected. The war became a test of endurance, and both sides bled. Commander Dante, watching the war from Baal, understood that the Pariah Nexus was not simply a battlefield, it was a preview. The Necrons had shown that they possessed the technology to nullify the warp, to render entire regions of space inhospitable to the Imperium's way of war. If they succeeded in expanding the Nexus, the Imperium would be forced to adapt or die. And adaptation, in the Imperium, was heresy. Dante sent what reinforcements he could, but his resources were finite. The Blood Angels were stretched thin, defending against Tyranids, Chaos, and now Necrons. Every battle brother deployed to the Pariah Nexus was one fewer defender on Baal. The calculation was brutal, but it was the only calculation that mattered. In the depths of Imperium Nihilus, Isolated worlds fought their own wars in silence. Some worlds declared independence, their governors deciding that if Terra could not protect them, they owed Terra nothing. Others turned to faith, the ecclesiarchy's preachers whipping populations into frenzies of devotion, convincing them that suffering was holy and death was salvation. A few worlds, desperate and isolated, accepted Xenos aid. Tau envoys offered vassalage. Eldari Farseers appeared on imperial worlds, speaking of shared threats and temporary alliances. Necron overlords, pursuing agendas incomprehensible to human minds, brokered ceasefires with planetary governors, sparing their worlds in exchange for unknown concessions. The Inquisition, when it learned of these pacts, declared them heresy and ordered exterminatus. But the Inquisition's reach in Imperium Nihilus was limited, and many of the heretical alliances went unpunished simply because there were no resources to punish them. The Imperium was fragmenting, not into rebellion, but into pragmatism. The defenders of Imperium Nihilus were learning that survival required flexibility, and flexibility was something the Imperium had never tolerated. It was a slow poison, a corruption of doctrine that would have consequences no one could yet predict. Commander Dante stood upon the walls of the fortress monastery on Baal and looked out at the stars. He had been granted the title of regent, but he commanded a realm that did not truly exist. A half of the Imperium that had been severed, left to fend for itself, expected to endure without hope of relief. He had lived 1,500 years. He had fought in wars that were legend. He had stood beside primarchs and saints. And now, in the twilight of his service, he was being asked to hold a line that could not be held. Dante did not despair. Despair was a luxury. He simply gave orders, deployed forces, and prepared for the next battle, because that was all he had ever done. And it was all he would do until the Emperor, in his mercy, finally granted him rest. The Pariah Nexus expanded. The Tyranids advanced. Chaos claimed system after system, and Imperium Nihilus, the dark half of the galaxy, burned, but it did not fall, because the defenders refused to let it fall. Because humanity, for all its flaws, had learned one lesson across 10,000 years of suffering. Survival was not about hope, it was about endurance. And the defenders of Imperium Nihilus would endure, even if endurance was all they had left. There is no peace. There will be no peace. The galaxy does not move toward resolution. It does not arc toward justice or redemption or any coherent end. It simply grinds forward, a machine of suffering that feeds itself, sustained by the bodies of the faithful and the faithless alike, burning through lives as fuel for a war that has no conclusion, because conclusion would require one side to fall, and neither side can afford to fall, because falling is extinction. This is the state of the galaxy in the 42nd millennium. This is where the timeline stands. The Imperium is fractured, but it endures. Imperium Sanctus, the light half, remains tethered to Terra, to the Astronomicon, to the skeletal infrastructure of a bureaucracy so vast that it has become indistinguishable from the civilization it administers. Reboot Guilliman rules from Terra, not as a tyrant, but as a manager of catastrophe. He enacts reforms that arrive centuries too late. He deploys the Primaris Space Marines, reinforcing chapters that were on the brink of extinction. He negotiates with factions that despise him, compromises with institutions that see him as a threat, and every day he wakes knowing that the Imperium he is trying to save is not worth saving, but he saves it anyway, because the alternative is annihilation. Guilliman has learned what the Emperor perhaps always knew, that humanity is not capable of governing itself with reason, that the Imperium's survival depends on faith, fear, and the grinding inertia of a billion worlds too exhausted to rebel. The reforms Guilliman enacts are pragmatic, streamlining supply lines, reducing bureaucratic redundancy, establishing new recruitment worlds for depleted chapters, deploying the Primaris across the Imperium to reinforce both loyal chapters and found new ones. But he cannot change the culture. He cannot undo 10,000 years of stagnation. The ecclesiarchy still preaches that suffering is holy. The Mechanicus still hoards knowledge and worships machines. The Administratum still loses worlds in clerical error. The Inquisition still burns planets on suspicion alone. Guilliman is trying to repair a corpse, and the corpse resists every effort to make it breathe again. Imperium Nihilus, the dark half, remains isolated. Commander Dante holds the line with forces that dwindle by the day. The Astronomicon does not reach the dark half, and warp travel is suicidal. Ships that attempt to cross the Great Rift rarely arrive at their destinations. The few that do bring news of horror, systems overrun by chaos, worlds consumed by tyrannids, Necron dynasties reclaiming territory they believe is theirs by ancient right. The defenders fight in isolation, knowing that reinforcement will not come, that they are holding ground, not because it can be held, but because retreating would mean conceding the dark half entirely. Dante coordinates what he can, but his authority is symbolic. He commands through respect, not infrastructure. The chapters that follow him do so because they trust him, not because they must. And Dante is dying. Not from wounds, though he has sustained those in abundance. He is dying from exhaustion, from the weight of 15 centuries of war. The black rage lurks at the edge of his consciousness, whispering that he is sanguineous, that he must return to the vengeful spirit and face Horus one final time. Dante resists, but the rage is patient. When Dante finally falls, whether to the rage or to an enemy blade, Imperium Nihilus will lose its symbolic heart, and the dark half, already fragmented, will splinter further. The Great Rift remains open. The Cicatrix Maledictum, the wound that split the galaxy, shows no sign of closing. Warp storms rage across its length, demon incursions erupt without warning, and entire sectors are rendered uninhabitable by the warp's corrosive presence. The rift is not simply a barrier. It is a highway for chaos, a conduit through which the ruinous powers pour their servants into real space without the need for elaborate rituals or summoning. Abaddon the Despoiler commands the largest Chaos Armada since the Heresy. The Black Legion has swollen with warbands rallying to the Warmaster's banner, drawn by the promise of plunder and the favor of the gods. Abaddon does not seek to conquer the Imperium outright. He seeks to bleed it, to force the Imperium to fight on so many fronts that its defenses collapse through sheer exhaustion. The strategy is working. The Imperium fights chaos on 1,000 worlds. The Death Guard claims plague worlds. The Thousand Suns build sorcerous enclaves. The World Eaters descend in frenzies of slaughter. The Emperor's children stage raids that are as much performance art as warfare, their depravity escalating with each engagement. And the Black Legion pushes deeper, claiming systems, fortifying positions, preparing for a war that will span centuries. But Abaddon is not the only threat from chaos. The Daemon Primarchs stir. Mortarion, humiliated by his defeat at Gilliman's hands, broods in the Garden of Nurgle, planning his return. Magnus the Red weaves sorceries in the planet of the sorcerers, his schemes incomprehensible to mortal minds. Fulgrim indulges in excesses that defy description, lost in sensation, occasionally emerging to inflict horror upon real space before retreating to his palace of depravity. Angron rages, leading the World Eaters in crusades of butchery, seeking death and finding only more enemies to kill. Lorgar, the first to fall, has withdrawn into contemplation. The Urizen sits in his tower on Sycharis, writing scriptures, crafting theologies, his purpose inscrutable. Some believe he is preparing for the final war. Others believe he has simply gone mad, lost in the contradictions of serving gods who are themselves contradictions. The Daemon Primarchs are demigods now, elevated by the ruinous powers, and they can return to real space whenever the warp permits. The Imperium cannot kill them, only banish them, and banishment is temporary. They will return. They always return. And then there is Vashtor, the Archiphane, the daemon who aspires to godhood. Vashtor is not one of the 4 chaos gods, but he seeks to become the 5th. He is the lord of corrupted technology, the patron of dark forges, a daemon who understands that power in the materium comes not just from worship, but from weaponry. Vashtor has been gathering artifacts, relics of the Dark Age, Necron technology, Ildari constructs, anything that can be repurposed, corrupted, and wielded. His ultimate goal is the construction of a weapon so powerful that it will elevate him to true godhood. The Imperium does not yet understand the scope of his ambition, but the pieces are moving into place. Vashtor's servants infiltrate Forge worlds, steal relics, and forge alliances with traitor tech priests who see him as the true Omnissiah. If Vashtor succeeds, the galaxy will face a 5th Chaos God, one who commands not just emotion, but industry, a god of corrupted progress. The Tyranids encircle the galaxy like a noose tightening. Hive fleets probe from every direction. Leviathan presses from beneath the galactic plane. Kraken's remnants stalk the eastern fringe. New fleets, unnamed and uncatalogued, emerge from the intergalactic void, each one a harbinger of the greater swarm yet to come. The Tyranids are hunger incarnate. They do not negotiate, they do not retreat. They consume, adapt, and move to the next target. Every world they devour makes them stronger. Every engagement teaches them how to counter the Imperium's weapons. The hive mind learns, and it does not forget. The Imperium's response is the same as it has always been. Burn the worlds the Tyranids target, deny them biomass, retreat, and regroup. It is a losing strategy, but it is the only strategy available. The Tyranids cannot be defeated in the traditional sense. They can only be delayed, and delay is all the Imperium has. Some within the Mechanicus have theorized that the Tyranids are fleeing something in the intergalactic void, that the hive fleets descending upon the galaxy are refugees rather than conquerors. If true, it raises a question no one wants to answer. What could make the Tyranids flee? The Necrons awaken in greater numbers. Tomb worlds rise across the galaxy, their populations stirring from 60 million year slumbers. The dynasties are fractious, their politics Byzantine, their goals incomprehensible to the younger races. Some seek to reclaim the galaxy as it was during the height of the Necrontyr Empire. Others pursue agendas shaped by madness, their neural engrams degraded by eons in stasis. The Silent King, Sarek, has returned, and he commands the loyalty of some dynasties, but not all. The Sortek dynasty follows him. The Mefrit dynasty does not. The Navok dynasty wages war for its own sake. The Nefrik dynasty exists partially out of phase with reality, pursuing goals that may not even be comprehensible in three-dimensional space. The Necrons do not see the Imperium as an enemy worthy of respect. They see humanity as an infestation, a plague of short-lived vermin squatting on worlds that belong to the Necrons by right of ancient conquest. When the Necrons reclaim a world, they do so without negotiation or mercy. The populations are exterminated, the infrastructure dismantled, and the planet rendered into a tomb world, silent and lifeless. But the Necrons are pragmatic. When the Tyranids threaten, the Necrons ally with the Imperium. When chaos encroaches, the Necrons deploy their forces to push it back, not out of altruism, but because chaos and the Tyranids threaten the galaxy the Necrons intend to rule. The Necrons are the galaxy's original masters, and they are patient. They have waited 60 million years. They can wait longer. The Aeldari fade into myth. The craft worlds drift through the void, their populations dwindling, their seers searching for paths to survival that grow narrower with each passing decade. The fall of the Aeldari was 10,000 years ago, but the wound has never healed. Slaanesh, the chaos god born from their excesses, hungers for their souls, and every Aeldari who dies without a spirit stone to preserve them is devoured. The craft-world Aeldari fight not for conquest, but preservation. They strike at the Imperium, the Orcs, the Necrons, anyone who threatens the ancient artifacts they seek to recover or the maiden worlds they claim as sacred. They are a dying species, and they know it. Their wars are desperate, calculated, and fought with the knowledge that every loss brings them closer to extinction. The Drukhari, the Dark Eldar of Komara, thrive in their city within the webway. They raid real space, stealing souls to stave off Slaanesh's hunger, inflicting torture and suffering because pain is the currency of their survival. They are immortal only so long as they feed the god that hunts them, and they have built an entire civilization on the foundation of suffering. The Ynnari, followers of Yniad, the nascent Aeldari god of death, seek to awaken their deity fully, believing that Yniad can destroy Slaanesh and free the Aeldari from their curse. They are heretics to both the craft worlds and the Drukhari, but they are also the Eldari's only hope of breaking the cycle. The Aeldari see the future. Their Farseers peer into the strands of fate, navigating probabilities, seeking the threads that lead to survival. But the future grows darker with each vision. The paths narrow, and the Eldari, for all their ancient wisdom, are running out of time. The Orcs thrive in the chaos. Where there is war, there are Orcs, and the galaxy is nothing but war. Wa-S erupt across every segmentum, great tides of greenskins surging across systems, fighting everything they encounter because fighting is what they were made to do. The orcs do not have a grand strategy. They do not need one. They are a biological weapon unleashed by the Old Ones during the War in Heaven, and they have never stopped doing what they were designed for, waging war. Gazkul Mag Uruk Thraka, the greatest orc warlord in the galaxy, leads the largest Wa since the War of the Beast. Gazkul is a prophet, a figure who believes he is destined to unite the orcs and conquer the galaxy. He has fought across hundreds of worlds, his legend growing with each victory. The orcs flock to his banner, and his Wag grows exponentially. Gazgul is also being hunted. Commissar Yarrick, the legendary hero of Armageddon, has made it his life's mission to kill the beast. The two are locked in a rivalry that has become legend, a duel that spans decades and systems, neither able to deliver the final blow. The orcs will never be defeated. They will never stop, and as long as the galaxy burns, they will thrive. The Tau expand with the optimism of those who have not yet learned despair. The Tau Empire, a young species in the eastern fringe, still believes in the greater good, in the idea that the galaxy can be united through cooperation and progress. They offer vassalage to human worlds, promising protection and prosperity. Some accept. The Imperium executes those who do as traitors. The Tau have faced the Tyranids. They have fought the orcs. They have encountered chaos, though they do not yet fully understand what it is, and with each encounter, their optimism erodes. The Fourth Sphere expansion ended in disaster, with Tau forces lost in the warp and emerging changed, tainted by something they cannot name. The Tau are learning what the Imperium has always known, that the galaxy is not a place where idealism survives. But they have not yet abandoned their philosophy. Not yet. The Emperor burns. Upon the Golden Throne, the Master of Mankind endures. For 10,000 years, he has sat in silence, his body a skeletal husk, his mind a psychic inferno that sustains the Astronomicon and holds the Webway Gate closed. 10,000 psychers are sacrificed daily to fuel the throne, their souls fed into the pyre, and still it is barely enough. The Emperor is no longer entirely human. His psychic presence in the warp has grown so vast that it distorts reality. Some believe he is becoming a god, a fifth chaos god, but one of order rather than entropy. Others believe he is simply dying, that the sacrifices are delaying the inevitable, that when the throne finally fails, the Emperor will die and Terra will fall. The truth is unknowable. The Emperor does not speak, he only burns, but his influence is felt. Living saints manifest across the Imperium, warriors imbued with his power, fighting in his name. Miracles occur on battlefields, bolts of light striking down demons, the faithful rising from mortal wounds. The Imperium calls it divine intervention, the skeptical call it psychic phenomena. The distinction no longer matters. Faith sustains the Imperium. And if the Emperor is becoming a god, then perhaps the ecclesiarchy was right all along. Gilliman despises the thought, but he cannot deny the evidence. The timeline does not end, it has no resolution. This is not a story of hope deferred. It is not a tale where the heroes gather their strength for one final battle and emerge victorious. The galaxy is locked in an eternal, grinding apocalypse, where survival is measured not in victory, but in how long the void can be held at bay. The Imperium fights chaos, the Tyranids, the Necrons, the Orcs, and itself. It fights heresy within and invasion without. It fights entropy, decay, and the slow collapse of institutions that were never meant to last 10,000 years. And it endures, not because it is strong, not because it is righteous, but because it is inexhaustible, because humanity, for all its flaws, has learned one truth across millennia of suffering, that survival is not about winning, it is about refusing to stop. The galaxy in twilight is a place of endless war. The Emperor decays, the Primarchs stir, the Chaos Gods feast, the Tyranids draw closer, the Necrons awaken, and the Imperium, fractured and bleeding, grinds forward into the dark. There is no peace, there will be no peace, there is only war, and in the grim darkness of the far future, that is all there has ever been.